It's tough to think of a game that fits the label of generation defining better than The Last of Us. Part 1. It's not that there was some groundbreaking element in the gameplay, which was a very competent blend of the most popular third-person mechanics of the time, trimmed of almost all the fat and polished to a glistening sheen. Mixture of action and stealth, light resource management, reading notes for clues about backstory, it made for a pretty good snapshot of what gaming looked like at the time. But the thing that really set it apart from the crowd back then was the way it used those mechanics in order to tell a focused and character-driven story, rather than the more plot-driven, MacGuffin-chasing thrill ride you could expect from most games of that era, and in fact from most games still today. From the very beginning of development, the design ethos of the game was to start with the story and the emotional through line of each scene, and then fill in the gameplay and set pieces around that. Not to say that had never been tried before, but it just so happened that Naughty Dog was fresh off the back of a blockbuster series with a third-person action template more or less ready to go, and uniquely positioned to put their sizable budget and hundreds of talented staff to work on a more humble and grounded project. Needless to say, it was a pretty big success. And so, when it came time to make the inevitable Part 2, the studio had to face the impossibly tricky balancing act of making a follow-up to one of the most beloved games of the preceding decade. On the one hand, it goes without saying that a sequel should attempt to improve on its predecessor, and I'm sure the creative members of the studio were eager to flex their muscles and use what they learned from the first game to innovate on the formula. And sometimes, innovation means changing the formula in some fundamental ways to avoid stagnating or retreading old ground, especially in a series as story-focused as this one. At the same time, however, the players of that first game will be bringing their own expectations and desires with them when they boot up the sequel, and toying with or subverting those expectations is a perilous gamble that can go both ways. Of course, you can never please everyone, and it's pointless to try, but still there's a question that hangs over every design decision and every new idea that enters the mix during a sequel's development. What will the fans think? When it comes to The Last of Us Part 2, I'm delighted to be able to say that the devs did not take the easy road and deliver more of the same. This is a truly ambitious game that takes some serious creative risks, and is not afraid to shatter the fans' expectations if that's what it takes to make something fresh. Later in the video I'll get into which of those risks I think paid off, but regardless of the game's successes and failures, I have a great respect for the developer's artistic integrity, and I suppose some props are due to Sony as well, for allowing their Naughty Dog a long enough leash to try and give their audience something they didn't know they wanted. Ignoring the period of review bombing from a vocal minority at release, which I think only goes to show just how passionate, or some would say entitled, a fanbase can be, the intervening years have shown the studio's gamble to be another highly successful one. Now, enough context, let's talk about the actual game. In terms of story, there's basically nothing I can say that doesn't immediately get me into spoiler territory, so I'll save it for after the video's intro. But if you haven't played this game and by some miracle you're one of the 4 people who hasn't had it spoiled already, then it's safe to say that you're in for plenty of surprises. As for whether there'll be pleasant surprises, that's another matter, and some of your reactions might depend on you. But as anyone who has finished the game can tell you, life isn't always pleasant. The story is pretty damn long, but I think that length is mostly justified in the grand scheme of what the game is trying to do, and there are only a small handful of sections that are leaning towards filler territory and risk undermining the game's bold new direction. Again, I can't say much just yet, but rest assured I will get to that later. This is also the kind of story that benefits from a second playthrough in order to fully digest it, which is why it's fortunate that the gameplay is for the most part outstandingly enjoyable. Mechanically, Part 2 picks up the baton handed over by the first game and drives it over the horizon in a rocket car. This is an experience at the very cutting edge of what the medium is currently capable of, and when it's working as intended, it can be a gloriously immersive ride. The levels are bigger and have tons of routes through them, the variety in encounters, enemy types and puzzles is greatly increased, and in a world of limited resources, you feel the weight and lasting consequences of every bullet fired, every health kit used, and every crafting material expended. It's abundantly clear that believability was at the absolute forefront of the developers' minds while working on this game. Which is not to say that the illusion never cracks, because there are plenty of times when it does, but when it's on a streak, this game can provide hours of continuous immersion. Just like its predecessor, the gameplay here is state-of-the-art in the truest sense, and it once again shows you a pretty good snapshot of what a modern gaming experience looks like after it's been polished to within an inch of its life. This can be a curse as well as a blessing though, and I spent a little too much time walking around the edges of rooms, mindlessly pressing Y to open drawers and pick up arbitrary resources for my liking. But I can look past that as a sign of the times and thank my lucky stars that at least they didn't make the whole thing into an open world with climbable towers and a slop trough full of copy-pasted content. On the whole then, my thoughts are very positive, and Naughty Dog have shown themselves once again to be masters of the craft and a studio at the pinnacle of their game. For all of this game's flaws and imperfections, the reality is that there are very, very few developers with the budget and talent to even attempt a project as ambitious as this, and even if The Last of Us Part 2 falls short of delivering wholesale on its lofty concept, it's still an unrivaled experience that will leave its mark on you. As a sequel, it's surprising, rewarding, and it sets an impossibly high standard for whatever comes next. But having seen just how seriously Naughty Dog takes their commitment to crafting consistent and meaningful experiences for their players, I trust that they have what it takes to reach even greater heights than this. Now, I think that's enough teasing, so let's dive in at the beginning and see how this game reintroduces us to the world of The Last of Us. It's not essential, but you might want to watch my video on the first game before proceeding with this one, to get a feel for my thoughts on how the series has developed over time. Like that previous video, I'll be paying a lot more attention to the story than I usually do, both because this story demands it as a major part of the experience, and in order to preserve some sense of what it feels like to play through it for the first time. This game is around 10 hours longer than the first one and has a lot more going on, so I hope you'll agree as you watch that I'm justified in finding about twice as much to say about it. Still, my intention here is to provide a critical analysis and not a summary, so I won't go over every single scene or this video really would be longer than the game. Finally, as always, there is no substitute for playing a game yourself, so I'd highly recommend doing that before watching further if you haven't already. And with that, let's begin.
Jesus Christ, Joel. What do you do?
I saved her.
The curtain rises on Joel recapping the events of the last game to his brother Tommy, before they share a quiet ride back down to Jackson, an isolated town with the luxury of being powered by a hydroelectric dam, which has become Joel and Ellie's new home. As far as opening scenes go, I think this one does a pretty good job of quickly pulling the player back into the world and setting up the dreadful tension of the lie that will continue to fester between the two main characters. It also does a good job of showing off exactly how good this game's presentation is, both in its environments, which rarely fail to impress with their visual details, and in close-up cutscenes of dialogue between characters, which hit an incredibly high benchmark of believability thanks to their naturalistic mocap performances. The scene that follows, where Joel hands over Ellie's first guitar, is punctuated with awkward silences that hang between lines of dialogue, and it's clear that those pauses are an intentional part of the scene, which sets it apart from most other games. The strained tension between the two is unmissable, and the strength of the excellent performances and voice work allows a lot of meaning to be carried through body language and subtext that doesn't need to be blurted out loud in direct dialogue. It's hard to overstate what a difference this makes to the believability of dramatic scenes, and the empathy it makes them capable of stirring in the player. Even when we can only see the back of a character's head, there's still plenty to read into what might be going through it. While it's no longer in a league of its own like the first game was, this is still miles ahead of anything else the industry has to offer, and it showcases just how far we've come in terms of integrating believable performances into interactive narratives. I also think it's praiseworthy that, unlike so many other devs I could mention, Naughty Dog hasn't taken the shortcut of renting out famous faces to plaster over their character models. These scenes are allowed to stand on their writing and acting alone, which they do admirably well. There is very occasionally a bit of Marvel-esque dialogue where characters just say out loud what the joke or the point of a scene is, but they're few and far between enough that I never found it annoying.
Fuck, this is awkward.
With all the introductory cutscenes out of the way, It's time to take control of Ellie after a 5-year time skip and get started on the introductory walking and talking sections. The game contains quite a lot of these pace-setting conversation scenes, so I might as well address them early. If you've played any big-budget third-person action games in the last 10 years, then you've probably grown accustomed to these cutscenes that aren't cutscenes and take them in your stride by now. For my part, I'm quite happy to accept them as a way of delivering exposition without breaking immersion. The longer the player retains uninterrupted control of their character, the better in my book. But there's a fine line to doing this well, and when a scene is on the wrong side of that line, it can feel like your time is being wasted. Walking through Jackson and acknowledging the little details that reveal what life there might be like is an enjoyable enough exercise, and it's a lot less abstract than picking up a series of notes left behind by the wordiest apocalypse survivors of all time. Crucially, in most exploration scenes like this, you're strolling around and absorbing the environment on your own time, and you can move on to the exit whenever you please, so they usually don't tend to irritate on subsequent playthroughs. Later on, however, there are a handful of scenes that break this rule, and for a couple of other reasons also deal a blow to immersion, but I'll get to them in a bit. For now, this sequence does its job of getting us reacquainted with Ellie and her existence in Jackson, as well as the new characters in her life, Jesse and love interest Dina. With introductions made and overindulgent cover shooting tutorial dispensed with, it's finally time to head out of Jackson on one of the regular patrols and see a little action. Except, as Ellie rides out, the camera, usually hovering in her personal space like it needs to learn about boundaries, hangs back, and soon cuts away to somewhere else, and someone else. Now, there's a lot to say here, and the surprise reveal of a second protagonist certainly makes for a bold opening, but it will be getting bolder. This scene introduces us to Abby, but all we can glean about her is that she's looking for someone, and that her single-minded obsession over her search disturbs even her companions.
You hear yourself?
With the benefit of hindsight that comes from multiple playthroughs, I find it easy to sympathise with Abby here and understand her frustrations, or maybe more accurately, to feel sorry for her and the ugly, all-consuming rage she carries that pushes everyone else away and makes her failed relationship with Owen quite tragic. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because on a first playthrough, when we know literally nothing about her, the best we can do is make some inferences about the nature of her relationship with Owen and guess that there might be a love triangle involved, but it's more or less impossible to extend any true sympathy to these perfect strangers. To be clear, I'm sure that's intentional, and we're supposed to be in the dark about her motivations and her purpose near Jackson, although there might already be a creeping dread rising in your stomach that this story's inciting incident is going to be a rough one. In the interest of picking up the pace a bit, suffice to say that the next 90 minutes or so sees our perspective jump back and forth between Ellie and Abby, and experiencing a bit of stealth and combat as both of them against everyone's favourite fungoids. I'll go into plenty more detail about combat mechanics, puzzle solving, resource management and general gameplay later, but for now I just want to make it through this intro where the plot is still being established. Ellie gets to have some walking, talking, flirting time with Dina, after which their relationship progresses into a romantic one, while Abby, in an amazing coincidence that you kind of just have to accept to move the story along, runs into exactly who she was looking for. One action set piece and close escape later, and Abby's on her way back to the cabin where her friends are staying, with Joel and Tommy as company, and it's here that the rough ride really begins.
Felt like you heard of us or something.
'Cause they have.
This is what I was talking about when I said that Naughty Dog wasn't afraid of pissing off the fans and giving them something unexpected, although the surprise was sort of ruined by this cutscene being leaked out of context before release. I get it, Joel is a beloved character and people don't want to see him die such a brutal, grisly, humiliating death, but that's precisely the point. On a first pass through this scene, the explicit intention is for the player to hate Abby as much as physically possible, as much as Ellie does. I know this for a fact because Neil Druckmann says so in the Making of documentary, which I would recommend to anyone interested. I suppose this is part of the reason that they had us playing as Abby for half of the prologue, to give her a chance to become a character in our minds before this pivotal scene. But the fact that half the prologue belongs to her also hints at another perspective shift that's coming much later. While there are two player characters present in this scene, obviously the player currently sympathises with one over the other, which leads to a weird sort of disconnect that scratches at the back of your mind and will be returning much more strongly later on. I've seen complaints that it's out of character for Joel to let down his guard and be surprised like this, but I don't think it's unbelievable that the last 5 years of a placid and sedentary life in Jackson have softened him, and it's implied elsewhere that it's not unusual to encounter travelers and recruit them into the settlement. Focusing on Joel's actions is missing the point, however, because the crucial thing that the entire plot hinges on here is that Joel dies not because of some mistake he's made, but because Abby chooses to make it so. For comparison, Tess's sacrificial death after an infected bite in part 1 kind of feels like it happens because the writers need to get her out of the picture so that Joel and Ellie can start bonding. If Joel's death feels just as senseless at the beginning of part 2, then that's only because we don't have enough information yet. If curiosity got the better of you and you watched this scene in isolation on the snuff site of your choice before release, then you may have felt the intended anger that the scene is meant to inspire, but without the context of a character to direct it towards, pointed at the developers instead. This is the only way I can possibly try and explain the backlash Naughty Dog received at release, including actual death threats, not only at the developers but at the voice actors too. I know it's a small minority, and also that people don't really mean what they say online, but that doesn't stop it from being shockingly cruel, and it's especially ironic given the themes of vengeance and forgiveness that percolate throughout this game. Like I said, toying with the expectations of a passionate fanbase can be playing with fire, though that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Personally, I managed to avoid specific spoilers before I played, but I'd heard enough to guess that a big twist was coming here. And I mean, something needs to happen to get the plot moving, so it might as well be something that gets the player fired up and emotionally invested, which this undeniably accomplishes. The making of documentary actually opens with Druckmann presenting the first draft of the plot to his colleagues, and it seems to me that he takes no little delight in their surprised responses to this brutal opening. That's not to say that the devs enjoyed killing off Joel just to upset people, because I'm sure it wasn't easy for them to do, but the fact that the scene has the intended emotional impact, even when it's being read in an office theatre, is surely a sign that they were on a winning track. All in all, I have a lot of respect for the creative risk the devs took here. They could have chased the easy money and churned out a speedy sequel with a story that writes itself, The Adventures of Joel and Ellie Part 2, but they didn't. Well, mostly they didn't, I'll come back to that later. For 90% of this game though, it's anyone's guess where the story is going, and you've got to give it kudos for striking out in a brave new direction. And after a brief scene where she and the player get to mourn Joel while looking around his house, that's exactly what Ellie does, heading for Seattle with Dina in tow to seek out vengeance on Abby and her crew, hunting them down one by one over 3 in-game days. With that, we have the basic outline of the plot sketched out, and we're finally done with the prologue, which means I think I'm more than overdue to start talking gameplay. Like the first game, The Last of Us Part 2 is a linear adventure in the Half-Life mold that sees you riding a carousel between exploration and resource gathering, light puzzle solving and navigation using physics objects, downtime to give the characters a chance to share their thoughts, and of course, a heaping dose of stealth combat encounters against a healthy diversity of different enemy types. In fact, the variety on display in this game is pretty astounding across the board. First you're fighting mushroom zombies, then you're doing some platforming, then you're solving a rope puzzle, then there's a small self-contained open world section with a little bit of everything. I'm sure you're dying to hear me talk about that part. Then you're fighting people, then you're avoiding tripwires, then there's a new type of infected, then there are dogs that can sniff you out, then you're driving a boat around. You get the idea. This game really doesn't want to see you get bored. Generally speaking, it's all paced quite well, and one scene flows into another naturally, with the possible exception of resource gathering, but when this game is on a roll, you can go for several hours through tons of different environments, levels and scenarios without ever having control taken away from you. That capacity for continuity, helped along by the fact that most of it is set in one location, is one of this game's strongest assets, and I'll be returning to that thought after we've seen a bit more of it. Despite the game's great variety, it's pretty much always clear what's expected of you in each scenario and what the way forward is. This effect is achieved not by covering all the important surfaces in white paint, but by clever use of colour, lighting and framing, which I greatly appreciate. Whenever the linear path loops back on itself though, the game has to cheat in order to keep you moving in the right direction, by just surreptitiously removing a path that was there previously. The vanishing bin outside the hotel and the disappearing climbing rope at the TV station are a couple of notable examples, but I'm sure there are more I didn't spot. On top of this cheating, you might eventually catch on to the pattern that in a lot of cases you can rely on half-open doors or narrow passageways to serve as the exit, and you will occasionally be subjected to a not-so-surprising surprise when you pass through them, often one that forces you to mash a button for a little while so that you can pretend the experience you're having is still interactive. In a game with a linear structure, I can't really see a way around this bottlenecking, and in any case the consistency it brings to navigation and encounter design is probably a good thing all told. After all, there are some things that you want to stay predictable throughout a playthrough. Crawling is always slower than running, headshots always deal more damage, sound always draws infected towards the source, exits are always clearly visible, and workbenches used for upgrading your weapons are always in a safe spot. Well, I guess that one isn't actually always true, but the adrenaline spiking shock of this scene is all the more effective and immersive precisely because it comes out of nowhere and surprises you with a threat at a moment when all of your previously instilled instincts are telling you that you're safe. Creating an expectation in the player and then using it against them later can be a very effective tool, and I'm pleased that the devs had the restraint to preserve the uniqueness of this scene and only do it once, and in an optional area no less. Hats off for that one, seriously thumbs up. There's a well-considered balance struck between variety and consistency, which is another of those elements that shows Naughty Dog to be a studio you can trust to know what they're doing. Since it seems that I'm starting this script off with a discussion of overall structure, I might as well get it out of the way and circle back to that small open world section I mentioned before, which is the only outlier in an otherwise strictly linear experience. Believe it or not, according to the Making of documentary, The Last of Us Part 2 began its development journey with plans to make a fully open world game inspired by Bloodborne of all things and based mostly around melee combat. There's a small vestige of the melee idea left over in the game's close quarters combat, and I suppose this little section is what remains of the open world concept. After a brief bit of on-rails platforming and puzzling to get past the quarantine wall, you're soon let loose into a section of downtown Seattle which serves as your first real introduction to the city on day one. Your goal here is to visit 2 specific buildings to get your hands on the gasoline you need to move on from the area, and each of those buildings funnels you in through a single entrance to a self-contained combat encounter that locks you in and follows the same linear rules as the rest of the game, so there's never any combat that takes place in the open world proper. You can do these in either order, and in typical open world fashion, there are a number of other points of interest you can check out as well, not so different from the short side paths you can explore during the rest of the game, just on a slightly larger and more open scale. Notably, there are no enemies in the large outdoor area, and only one of the optional detours leads to an enemy encounter. Since that optional encounter sees you entering and exiting through the same hole in the wall, this presents an incredibly simple and obvious way to cheese it by just running back the way you came if you get spotted, which causes the Shrigma males inside to immediately forget you exist. This isn't a huge deal, and it's easily forgivable because this is the only place in the entire game where this is possible, but the reason it's possible is because there's an open world outside to run back to, and if I had to guess, I'd say that this problem is a major reason why the original idea of making the whole game open world was scrapped. This is also probably why the 2 obligatory areas in this section close the entrance behind you and force you back onto a linear set of rails until you're done with them. Despite, or maybe because of, the lack of enemies in the overworld, this outdoor area is probably the high point of free exploration in the game, and a reasonably enjoyable implementation of the open world concept, on a first playthrough, because it's small, it's dense with things to do, and most importantly, it's dense with unique things to do, not just the same crap copied and pasted 600 times. On top of that, you actually need to use your own senses to look around and identify the spots that are worth investigating. They're not just handed to you for free on some all-seeing map. Well, half of them aren't anyway. There's nothing whatsoever in the menu, HUD, or dialogue telling you that you should try and get to this fire engine, but if you're attentive enough to spot it and think it's worth checking out, you're rewarded with the usual goodies, yeah, but you're also rewarded with the navigation challenge, albeit a simple one, of figuring out how to get to it and how to use its hose as a climbing rope. Point is, there aren't just pockets of resources lying around the area for you to ride between and thoughtlessly hoover up. You have to actually do something to get your hands on them, and you're mostly left to your own devices when it comes to both identifying and traversing optional locations of interest, which feels quite rewarding and liberating. Or at least it does on that first playthrough, because on subsequent ones when the novelty has worn off, going through the motions of exploring every single spot to do some trivial platforming and collect its resources starts to wear a bit thin. Now, the first playthrough is the most important, and on that first run, the spectacle of being let loose into such an immersive and well-rendered representation of a ruined city centre is enough to overpower any nagging thoughts about the lack of depth to that exploration. Still, I think it's worth observing how this section feels on a second pass once the rose-tinted gas mask has come off, because you can't rely on spectacle to carry your whole game, and you need to have solid mechanics underneath it that should ideally be interesting to engage with multiple times. Make no mistake, gathering resources can be a time-consuming chore in the linear majority of the game as well, which is why I'll devote several paragraphs to the problem later in the video. But it has to be said that it grates a hell of a lot more in an open environment where the time spent trotting between nodes adds several more minutes of tedium to the affair. Of course, it's also technically true that all of this scavenging is optional, but in a game where resources are limited, ignoring opportunities to get more of them for free is a foolish move, so you feel a pressure to do it, even if it's boring. Which it is. Unfortunately, that's not my final criticism of this sequence, because I'm a bit disappointed that the devs thought it was necessary to include a map here, though at least they get points for making it diegetic. I don't love that Ellie draws question marks all over it whenever you read a note directing you towards a location of interest, but maybe this is just a me thing due to the negative association I have with them after their overuse in other fully open world slop games. Definitely my least favourite piece of punctuation. I'm just saying it's well established that Ellie is a competent artist, so why not have her draw little pictures instead? Anyway, that's a minor gripe, and I'm well aware that I could be alone in caring about it, so I can let it go. What I also find annoying about this map, however, and what I'm a bit less willing to let go, is the icon that appears on it to show your current location. In fairness to the game, an attempt is made to present this icon as diegetic when you first open the map by having Dina point out your location to make the icon emerge, I suppose with the implication that she or Ellie does so invisibly every other time you open the map as well. But the thing is, if Dina is capable of analysing her surroundings to figure out where she is on a map, then the player is capable of doing it too, and I don't need, nor do I want, the game to do it for me. It would have made for far more interesting navigation if the player was responsible for figuring out their position for themselves using landmarks. Maps are a thing that exists, hot take alert, and I don't object outright to them being included in games. But when it's an omniscient, magical game logic map that gets updated in real time and provides more information to the player than the actual three-dimensional world they're supposed to be inhabiting, I consider that to be a big problem. Granted, this map's inclusion is a lot more thoughtful than in the average open world game, but when there's still so much room for improvement, I think I'm justified in calling out its shortcomings. Putting the map annoyances and the resource gathering tedium to one side, I think there's definite potential in the non-linear structure being experimented with here, and as I said, I enjoyed this sequence on my first playthrough, exploring and using my own senses to find and then navigate around points of interest. The key to the experiment's success, however, is probably the small scope of the open area, which obviously made developing it and filling it with things to do a lot more manageable. But it also means that when you're playing it, it's over before it has a chance to become repetitive. For that reason, I'm skeptical how well this model would scale up to a map hundreds of times the size, although something tells me we'll be finding out sooner or later. I think one way forward for the open world concept would be to implement some kind of cost to exploration that could serve to make it more interesting. Whether that's a time limit, an oxygen meter, a wave of darkness, or enemies chasing you across the map, whatever, just something to prevent the tedious strategy of combing the map for every single available resource from being the obviously sensible one. The fact that Naughty Dog recognized that the fully open world wasn't working for this game and abandoned it in favor of a mostly linear approach gives me hope that they're aware of the limitations in the concept, and they might be capable of cracking it and making it work on their next attempt. We'll see. Leaving the open world behind, I'll stick to the theme of exploration and move on to discussing the side paths and optional areas found in the linear majority of the game, along with the puzzles and mini-challenges that often come along with them. Generally, these come in two forms: safes and locked rooms. Opening a safe is pretty much always as simple as looking nearby for a note, which will either tell you the code outright or point you towards something in the environment that conceals the code. It's a bit of a stretch that the user of a safe would write this down and then put it in the same room as the safe, but no harder to believe than the amazing frequency with which people in this world use their final moments to scribble some exposition on paper, so it's not worth complaining about. In any case, I don't think this safe cracking is really intended to challenge the player in any way, but just to make them slow down and take in the environment a little bit, something that's worth doing every now and then to appreciate the small details. And of course, they usually contain a worthy and sometimes unique prize, so you won't want to skip them. On the more varied side of exploration and puzzle solving are the locked doors, which you can encounter off the critical path and always serve as a clue that there's another way inside if you look around a bit. Sometimes this is as simple as going around and climbing in through a window, which isn't exactly inspired, but you are occasionally asked to use your wits and do a bit of problem solving or platforming. While the platforming in this game is incredibly superficial, there's still something kind of satisfying about it because of the believability of the environments. Jumping gaps, breaking windows, climbing up scenery and balancing on narrow walkways don't feel like gamey abstractions when they take place in such a naturalistic setting, which I suppose is another way that the dazzling spectacle of the game's presentation helps to paper over the simplicity of certain mechanics. Thankfully, not all the movement mechanics are quite so simple, and the inclusion of rope throwing, rope swinging physics puzzles adds a fresh bit of novelty that's a lot more dynamic than the movable ladders and planks that plagued the first game. What annoyed me about them last time was their insultingly limited interactivity, which leaned on the use of button prompts to tell the player what they were and weren't allowed to do with them. With the ropes in the sequel, you can throw them anywhere you please without being restrained by context sensitivity, so you need to do a bit of spatial reasoning and it's not immediately obvious what you need to do with them. But because ropes only show up in the small handful of scenes where you're expected to use one, it is immediately obvious that you should be looking for an overhang to throw it over, and this predictability ruins some of the dynamism in what could have been a more freeform mechanic. To make interactions with ropes more interesting, this game could have borrowed an idea from its predecessor, where getting through a locked door required you to use some resources, usually a craftable shiv. For the sequel, if ropes were a craftable and expendable item that you could keep in your inventory and have access to at any time, using them to solve puzzles in side areas would be far less obvious and far less context sensitive than it is now, and maybe there could have been some use for them in combat encounters as well, to help you make traps or get to high ground faster or something like that. Think of the rope arrows in Thief, which are a limited resource that can be deployed by the player at any time and onto any wooden surface, and you'll see just how much more dynamic it is than a puzzle that gives away the solution the instant you see a button prompt. Just to further illustrate this point about context sensitivity, with an example of something The Last of Us does very well, you know in other third-person action games when you have to press a dedicated button to get in and out of cover? Rather than abstracting that concept into a digital state that the player is either in or not in, The Last of Us handles the idea of cover in a far more dynamic and immersive way, allowing the player to intuitively use the same movement controls that they always have access to. I think you see what I mean. The more global and less context sensitive you can make the interactions available to the player, the better, and if that also means fewer button prompts, then that's a very welcome side effect. Applying this principle to the rope puzzles, and actually to as many mechanics as possible, is a goal that I think any designer striving to craft an immersive experience should aim for. Now, while I'm here, I think it's worth saying a few words about immersion more broadly before returning to the story. I've already praised the game's very believable presentation a few times, and while this definitely contributes towards its immersive potential, I want to be clear that immersion and realism are not the same thing. It doesn't matter if an experience is strictly realistic or not. What matters for immersion is consistency, and there are a few things that I mean by that, all of which sort of go hand in hand. One is consistency of control, where the player knows with certainty what the consequences of every button press will be. This is why a minute ago I was just making such a big deal about global mechanics and minimizing context sensitivity, because in my book, anytime you need to put a button prompt on screen is a failure of intuitive design. To give praise where it's due, there are moments where the game does an excellent job of being intuitive, and no prompt at all was necessary to inform me that I needed to press forward and A to grab Dina's hand here. Likewise when getting onto the bottom of ladders. If you use exactly the same input to try and get onto the top of a ladder, however, this will happen. And while I quickly learned what the game expected of me here, I know I'm not the only person who experienced this. Maybe you see what I mean about the importance of consistency, and seeing your button presses lead to an outcome that you didn't intend is about as immersion breaking as it gets. Including button prompts for unique interactions with puzzle objects is one thing, but when we're talking about combat encounters, which are a major component of the game where the rules are almost always consistent, the context-sensitive action of performing stealth kills kind of rubs me the wrong way. I don't think these prompts are there to remind you of the controls, which you will most definitely have internalized at some point during this 25-hour experience. They're actually there to inform you when you're close enough for the button presses to register the input you want. On grounded mode, the highest difficulty, these prompts are removed, which I appreciate as an attempt to improve immersion by removing clutter from the screen. But in fact, this only brings the problem into starker focus, as it leads to the player, at least in my case, repeatedly mashing Y as they close in behind an enemy and aren't able to resolve the ambiguity of distance without some kind of signal from the game. Maybe a sound cue like hearing the enemy's heartbeat or breathing, or a visual one like Ellie reaching a hand out or unfolding her knife, could provide a more immersive signifier for the player than a floating bit of text. Next up in my immersion checklist is consistency of setting, or consistency of context if you want to keep up the alliteration. Obviously this means that the setting should be internally consistent, but I would also include that the players' and other characters' interactions with the environment should be consistent as well. As before, realism can certainly contribute to immersion here, and a certain amount is necessary to avoid clashing with the realistic graphical style, but still it's nowhere near as important as consistency. If you look at how the torch works, you can see that it always follows the camera rather than the actual character model, which is unrealistic but quite obviously a good thing for the sake of clarity and precision during gameplay. It feels so natural for the light to follow your inputs as the player rather than the movements of the character model that it might be a while before you even notice the discrepancy, if at all. This ties into consistency of control as well, and as I said, all of these factors go hand in hand. One part of the world that doesn't remain consistent throughout the game is the life cycles of the infected. In the prologue, we come across the corpse of a moose they've started chowing down on, but later in Seattle, Ellie breaks into a garage where they've apparently been hanging out for years, locked in without starving to death. So which is it? Do they need to eat, or don't they? Thinking about this too hard can bring you dangerously close to undermining the entire setting. The placement of resources in the environment is something that can go both ways when it comes to consistency. Scrap is most often found in workshops or garages, meds are predominantly found in bathrooms, and whenever you find a big stash, there's usually some context provided for what they're doing there. Most other resources, however, are kind of arbitrary in their placement, and will just show up in random drawers and cupboards with little justification. This is not to say that every single drawer needs to have a note attached with a tragic backstory of where the bullet or rag inside came from, but when the standard has been set elsewhere in the game that materials are found in places they have a reason to be in, encountering examples that don't meet that standard can shatter the game's immersive illusion. Mechanically, the way this game handles resources is one of its most immersive features. The world of The Last of Us is a world of scarcity, where essential supplies produced before the apocalypse are infinitely precious, and the player experiences this scarcity firsthand in the gameplay, which forces them to treat their limited resources carefully and make consequential choices about how to use them. This is not a new idea, of course, but it still does an excellent job of pulling the player more closely into their role as an occupant of that world. And when you see other characters doing the same thing, it reinforces that you're not just following the arbitrary rules of a game, you're following the rules of a world that you're inhabiting. Back in the prologue, when Owen says, "Save your bullets," and throws a Molotov to deal with several infected at once, he's using exactly the same logic that a resource-conscious player would. But when the opposite happens, and cutscenes show characters doing things that aren't consistent with the rules of the game, it feels false, like the devs are cheating just to get the parts in place for whatever set piece they have in mind. When Ellie breaks into the hospital and confronts Nora, one of her targets who was present when Joel was killed, Nora says that shooting her will bring all of the guards down on them. Except, as the player, I know that 2 seconds before this cutscene began, that pistol had a homemade silencer on it, so where did it go? The answer to that question is, the writers needed it to not exist, so for this cutscene, it doesn't. This might sound like a nitpick to you, and maybe it is, but when inconsistencies like this appear not in cutscenes, but in interactive sequences, I hope you can agree that it deserves calling out and is counterproductive to immersion. More than once, the game shuffles you into an on-rails shootout from inside a vehicle, and in order to make this work, it just has to give you infinite ammo for the duration of the set piece. I trust it's obvious why this is a problem. Conserving ammo and being careful with every bullet fired is a fundamental instinct that you spend 99% of the game having drilled into you, and when it occasionally just asks you to forget about that for a few minutes, it's another inconsistency that can be quite jarring. Just like in Nora's cutscene, the usual rules of the game, and the world, are temporarily suspended so that the devs can squeeze you into a 2-minute roller coaster that feels inauthentic and isn't true to the spirit of the rest of the game, where your actions actually have consequences. The final ingredient in my immersion cocktail is consistency of character. By this, I don't mean that characters behave in a consistent or believable way, or that the dialogue is good or anything like that. That's the kind of thing I would include in the previous bit about the setting. What I mean by consistency of character is that there's an alignment between the player's motivations and thought processes and those of the character they're playing as. In a third-person game with a predefined character whose body we're manipulating, there will always be some distance. You're not playing as a blank slate that you can self-insert into, as you are in something like Subnautica, but as much as possible, that distance should be shortened, and the sympathy between player and avatar maximized. The breathless tension of lying frozen in the grass, watching an enemy skulk past as they hunt for you and praying they don't turn this way, is one that the player is supposed to feel in unity with Ellie. That is immersion, and when this game is at its best, it delivers that tension in spades. Key to achieving that end is the player's sense that their actions carry lasting consequences, not just for the area they're currently in, but for the entirety of their playthrough. The amount of health, ammo, and resources the player is carrying at any given time, and therefore how safe or capable they feel at the start of an encounter, is a direct result of their actions and choices in previous encounters. When you know that every bullet fired and health kit used is one you won't be carrying forward, you have a powerful incentive to conserve them and avoid combat, which means you feel the same anxious desire to stay undetected that Ellie does, and the same panicked desperation when you get caught. I think it's no exaggeration to say that this continuity of consequences is one of the game's strongest assets, and the knowledge that every action in combat has a lasting impact may be the greatest contributor to this game's sublime immersion. If you want to see proof of this, you can use the main menu after completing the game to skip from encounter to encounter. When you play them in isolation, starting each one with a random assignment of ammo to use freely, the gameplay just doesn't hit the same because you know your choices have no long-term impacts and there's no need to be careful with resources. So, to better bring out and emphasize the game's continuity of consequences, it's important to allow the player to stay in control without interruption for as long and as unbroken a length of time as possible, with cutscenes and time skips kept to a minimum, but also, and this is where it gets tricky, keeping deaths and respawns to a minimum. Getting shreked and being sent back in time to a checkpoint is a momentum-killing downer that cuts the cord between you and the player character with an uncomfortable jolt. It's a reminder that you and your avatar are not one and the same after all. You and Ellie may both want to avoid dying, but she is at risk of having her face turned into mulch by this fungal sumo wrestler, while the only thing the player is at risk of is losing a few minutes replaying a section of gameplay. When this fact is hidden out of sight, it's very easy to keep it out of mind and stay happily under the game's immersive spell. But once the cat's out of the bag, that immersion splinters and you can see through it to the mechanical wheels underneath. The reason this is so tricky to balance is because the danger, or at least the perceived danger of dying, is necessary for the player to feel any tension in an action sequence. And yet once the threshold is reached and death occurs, the player can't ignore the fact that, ironically, dying is one of the least consequential things you can do in this game, since it returns all your ammo and resources and lets you try again with no harm done. Death may be the most obvious example, but in fact there are many areas in the game where your actions don't really have consequences. Anytime you're not in one of the prescribed and strictly enclosed combat encounters, which are always clearly signposted to the player so there's never any ambiguity, you're essentially just on rails waiting to get to the next one. It makes zero difference how careful you are as the player. If the game wants Ellie to get caught or stumble into a set piece or encounter, then it's gonna happen no matter what, usually after squeezing through a narrow gap that presents the only way forward. This is inevitable in a linear game, and it's in the same family of tropes as the old winning the gameplay, losing the cutscene cliché. But inevitable or not, it creates a distance between Ellie and the player, so that when she says "stay low" to Dina outside the TV station, it's a meaningless warning to a player who knows with absolute certainty that the game isn't going to put them in any danger here. The dialogue implies danger and consequences that we know don't exist mechanically. Another textbook instance of this comes in on-rails scenes where the linear script says that you pass close to enemies without getting spotted. In these scenes, you're completely prevented from using your torch. The button to switch it on just doesn't do anything. This is because ordinarily, when you're in a section of the game where actions actually have consequences, switching on your light would alert an enemy to your presence, and presumably the devs wanted to avoid the incongruity of these scripted NPCs not reacting to a light being shined in their faces. But what this reveals is that in this sequence, you're not supposed to, in fact, you're not allowed to get spotted by these enemies, because the game isn't done holding your hand into the next cutscene yet. Once again, there's a mismatch between the character's behaviour and the player's knowledge that they're in no danger whatsoever, and the thread between player and avatar starts to fray. This is also a great example to show how the consistency, or inconsistency, of control, context and character all weave together to either make or break a game's immersive potential. So, to wrap up my thoughts on immersion, I just want to reassure you, and myself, that I'm not alone in thinking so deeply about this subject, and it's something that Naughty Dog in particular have at the front of their minds when designing a gameplay scenario. They begin with a goal of believability and an idea of what they want the player to experience in a given scene, and then iterate on it again and again to mould that emotional journey into as consistent and credible a shape as possible. Crucially, this can involve removing elements from a sequence as well as adding them. For instance, they determined that it just isn't believable that human enemies would leave your horse alive if they got into a gunfight with you, and so there are no human enemies in the open world section while you have your horse. When you do run into humans not long afterwards, they kill your horse immediately. I still find this phrase awful, but Naughty Dog's insistence in referring to the player as being on the stick shows just how much they put the player's experience above all else, and starting from this principle is surely one of the things that sets their studio apart. Besides the obvious reference to the person holding the controller and moving the main character around, I think the phrase also contains an acknowledgement that this is the person the devs are aiming to take on the emotional and tense thrill rides that their games provide. This is the person that the devs want to feel that sympathetic connection with Ellie. The same tension she feels during stealth, the same terror she feels during combat, and even in cutscenes, the same primal hatred and desire for revenge that she feels towards Abby. And with that, I think it's time to get back to the story. As promised, I'm not going to labour over every scene, but I'll cover what I see as the important beats. A few months after the prologue, Ellie and Dina arrive in Seattle seeking the Washington Liberation Front, aka the Wolves, and the crew responsible for Joel's demise. Tommy is a few days ahead of them, and the violent remnants of his passage lets them know they're on the right track. After encountering the wolves for themselves, they follow a chain of clues that lead them to a handy stack of Polaroids detailing their targets, and take refuge in an old theatre at the end of the first day. Along the way, Dina reveals to Ellie that she's pregnant, and Ellie makes a confession of her own in divulging her immunity. The latter has zero effect on the plot, and I quite like that this makes for 2 games in a row where her immunity is actually sort of incidental to the story. It's a reminder that this tale is very much character focused, and the evolving relationships and interactions between those characters are of infinitely more interest than whatever excuse the devs can come up with to move them from A to B. Dina's pregnancy ends up being the far more consequential reveal, as it creates an impetus to leave Seattle and get her back to the safety of Jackson once they've caught up with Tommy. Though it's a safe bet that the player will still care far more about getting revenge for Joel than keeping Dina safe, and I think Ellie does too.
Well, you're a burden now, aren't you?
On the second day, Jesse shows up to help the others, and after bringing him back to the theatre, Ellie strikes out alone for the hospital to confront Nora, one of the targets on her list. Along the way, she has her first confrontation with the Seraphites, or Scars as the wolves call them, a certifiably insane cult who worship their martyred prophet and are locked in a seemingly never-ending feud with the wolves. There are only a few thousand people on either side of this conflict, so there is definitely enough space for them all to live in peace, but any possibility of trust or coexistence between them has been annihilated by years of senseless brutality towards each other. Their rivalry is another thing that feels quite incidental to the character-led story, but it provides a backdrop of a recurring cycle of violence that obviously resonates with Ellie's own quest for retribution. When she reaches the hospital and finds Nora, it's the first time she gets to actually speak to one of her targets on her terms, and I think what she says is quite revealing. Ellie is pursuing revenge with a suicidal commitment, and is willing to sacrifice basically anything to get it. She knows that getting what she's chasing won't fix anything or make her any happier, but she has nothing else, or at least that's how she sees it. Every waking moment is pain, and it seems like part of her wishes they had killed her in that cabin.
We could have killed you. Maybe you should have.
And so, when she drags Nora down to the spore-filled basement to interrogate her about Abby's whereabouts before she turns into a mushroom, you know that by interrogate, I mean brutally torture. Ellie discovers that Nora, and presumably the rest of Abby's crew, are former Fireflies and know about Joel's actions at the end of the previous game, which clues us in to why they wanted him dead to begin with. Here is also where I think we're supposed to start catching on to Ellie's single-minded madness and her descent into a hate-filled murder monster. Specific attention is drawn to this by asking the player to press a button to initiate her punishment on Nora. Obviously there's no player choice involved here, and Ellie will wait forever until you press it, but nevertheless it makes this scene feel like a point of no return, and it pulls you down into the dark pit with her before cutting to black. Back at the theatre after the adrenaline has worn off, Ellie appears visibly shaken by her own actions, but she has the information she was hoping for. Abby is holed up in the aquarium. The next day, the third and final, Ellie and Jesse set out to get there. At this point they both know about Dina's pregnancy, and Jesse's understandable priority is getting her out of Seattle and to safety, given that he's the daddy. As far as he knows, the plan is just to find Tommy and retreat back to Jackson, and when he double checks that Ellie is on the same page, she says that she is. Jesse seems to accept it, but as the player we've seen what Ellie's true feelings are, and we know that she's lying right to his face.
Dina should be back in Jackson.
What's more, it's almost a certainty that the player will agree with her in continuing to thirst for vengeance. While passing through a flooded shopping mall, the pair overhear some wolves chattering about a lone sniper over at the marina, which sounds a hell of a lot like Tommy, so Jesse wants to head there instead of to the aquarium. But Abby is at the aquarium, which means that Ellie is willing to make any excuse or rationalization she needs to in order to prioritize going there. While the player already knows about Ellie's all-consuming obsession, this scene gives another character the chance to react to it, and lets us see the human consequences. Jesse exits in disgust to go and help Tommy, leaving Ellie to steal a boat and head for the aquarium alone. When she finally makes it, she breaks in, kills this stupid dog, interrupts Owen and Mel mid-argument, botches an attempted interrogation of them, and ends up murdering both when they try to attack her. Owen's final words are used to inform Ellie that Mel was pregnant, and just as she's reeling from the shell shock of that revelation, Tommy and Jesse show up to save her from herself and get her out of there. Clearly, this scene is supposed to serve as another pivotal turning point that shows how far Ellie has fallen, but I have mixed thoughts about it and I'm not so sure it succeeds. First of all, Ellie didn't know that Mel was pregnant when she was being attacked by her with a knife and turned it back on her in self-defense, so I actually think this is less shocking than her torture of Nora. The belly-concealing coat Mel is wearing is a bit of a stretch, and it's tragically convenient that neither she nor Owen thought to mention it until it was too late, but okay, fine, it all happened quickly and there wasn't much time for critical thinking. Even if we accept all this at face value though, I still think the scene falls flat on a first viewing. These characters are almost complete strangers to Ellie and to the player, and as far as we know, all of Abby's crew are just plot devices for the player to kill off one by one. The reason that Joel and Ellie's relationship was meaningful and resonated so well with players is because we witnessed and experienced it changing over time, so it feels well earned. We knew the journey that the characters had been through, we knew how it affected them, and we knew firsthand why they had the relationship that they did. We weren't just told about it after he was already dead. Well, it turns out that's not actually true either, but I'll get to that in just a second. Point is, you can give a character the most tragic backstory of all time, but it will mean nothing to the audience if they haven't been on that journey with them. And in fact, it can even start to look kind of farcical if you dial up the tragedy too much. Like, for instance, Ellie killing an arguing couple only for one of them to use his dying breath to say that the other one was pregnant. If you want the player to feel like these characters only exist as a dramatic foil to allow Ellie to go on her own emotional journey, then I really can't think of a better way than this. All that said, there's an obvious parallel here to Dina's pregnancy, and if Ellie has a stronger reaction here than after the several dozen other murders she's committed this week, then we can chalk it up to her getting a sudden reminder of exactly what she's putting at stake by maniacally chasing after vengeance. She goes along with Tommy and Jesse without complaint, and seems to forget for a moment that the reason she came to the aquarium was to look for Abby. And just by the way, I think it's worth repeating that the reason there's so much room to discuss and overanalyze the behaviour of these characters is because of the incredible effort that was put into making the performances, voice work, and facial capture in these scenes believable, which is one thing that I don't think this game ever stumbles on. I may quibble about the contents of a scene, but the quality of the presentation is inarguable. Anyway, once the gang is all back at the theatre and making plans to get out of Seattle, Ellie seems to be willing to accept the necessity of leaving without confronting Abby. Until, that is, Abby shows up herself, Jesse takes one for the team, and we move into the final... Oh wait, hold on, there's something I forgot to cover. Let's just put a pin in this scene and come back to it. Throughout Ellie's 3 days in Seattle, the continuity is occasionally broken up by a number of lengthy flashback sequences, all of which cut back in time to show her relationship with Joel in the years before his death. To put it bluntly, I don't like this, and I think it undermines the rest of Ellie's story in multiple ways. I've praised Naughty Dog a few times for having the guts to go in an unexpected direction with this sequel, and resist the temptation to retread old ground with more of the same. Which is why I find it disappointing that they clearly tried to do both. Instead of committing to the bold concept of killing him off, the devs intermittently resurrect Joel for sentimental flashbacks, and it feels like they wanted to have their cake and eat it. The first one, an excursion to a science museum on Ellie's birthday, has plenty of charming moments and is enjoyable enough on a first playthrough, but when you already know what Joel's fate is going to be, taking your time over a long, slow walk and talk section designed to endear him to you just feels a bit needless. Either the player liked him enough to be disturbed by his death back in the prologue, or they didn't. There's no point in trying to reinforce it so long after the fact, and we don't learn anything that we didn't already know. The earlier scene where Ellie looks around Joel's house after his death feels like an infinitely more honest way of exploring and adding to his character than repeatedly bringing him back to life. Here the game holds your hand through mourning him and coming to terms with him being gone and his story being over, and then later it says, just kidding, here's several extra bits of backstory we wanted you to know. My point here is not that any of these flashback sequences are bad in isolation, because the dramatic scenes are really good in isolation. My point is that they stick out like a sore thumb when inserted into the middle of a completely different narrative, which is exactly how they're presented to us. On my second playthrough, I wanted to skip them, but I wasn't allowed. Now you might be thinking, whoa now, hold on there, isn't there gameplay in one of them there flashbacks? And yes, there is a standoff and a bloater encounter to offer some combat to liven up the second flashback in the hotel, but this is gameplay of zero consequence. In the rest of the game, one scene flows into another with a continuity of health, ammo and resources that make every decision an impactful one with lasting consequences. This flashback is the polar opposite of that, and it pulls the double whammy of A, breaking the continuity of context in the present day narrative in Seattle by uprooting you and dropping you in another time and place, and B, breaking the continuity of control by forcing you through a series of unskippable, inconsequential encounters that break the rules of the rest of the game. It goes completely against the game's immersive strengths to keep jumping you back and forth like this, and gives it a structure closer to a film or TV series, which I don't think is a good thing. So the devs better have a damn good reason for making us sit through it, right? Well, there is a narrative purpose to these flashbacks, which is good because there certainly isn't a gameplay one. That purpose is to resolve the tension left over at the conclusion of the first game, where Ellie knows that Joel hasn't told her the truth about what happened in the Firefly Hospital. That lie has been simmering between them ever since, and it's something that Ellie quite rightly can't let go of. The first flashback shows them having a good time together, but ends with a reminder that there's no escaping the mistrust that she feels. By the time of the second flashback, this has boiled over into a bitter resentment in Ellie, who can barely stand to talk to Joel. She broaches the subject after an extended combat encounter forces them to cooperate, and he repeats the lie once again and shuts the conversation down.
Is there something else you'd like to rehash?
Pushing Ellie to take matters into her own hands, and in the third flashback, to travel back to the Firefly Hospital and look around for herself.
You talk to me. You don't just leave me a goddamn note.
When Joel catches up to her and she presents him with incontrovertible proof that he's been lying to her, he finally confesses. Now this is the scene that all of these flashbacks were really here to facilitate, and what a scene it is. You can see in Joel's face and hear in his voice the years of bottled up anguish that he's just barely capable of holding back, lip trembling as he bears his deepest secret to the one person least likely to sympathize with it. Not only was Joel personally responsible for Ellie's survivor's guilt, he also wasn't man enough to own up to it, and allowed her to torture herself with hypotheticals and uncertainties for years before she forced the truth out of him. You can try and argue that he meant well or was trying to protect her, but there was only one person he was thinking of when he picked Ellie up off that hospital bed, and it was himself. Her response to learning all this is understandably distraught, and she leaves vowing that her relationship with Joel is done for good. Incidentally, I think this scene puts to bed the unintentional ambiguity from the first game of whether the shambolic fireflies were capable of making a cure or not. Every character who knows about it declares with absolute certainty that Ellie's death would have led to a cure, the kind of certainty that only a scriptwriter could put in their mouths. And so I think it's safe to say that we're not supposed to question this element of the plot, even though it's pretty shaky if you ask me. Both parties turn in a spectacular performance here, and this is an absolute knockout of a dramatic scene that is a delight to watch. But the revelation that Ellie knows about this in the present day casts all of her actions and motivations in a new light, especially back in the prologue as she watches Joel die, which I think is a little bit unfair and creates some distance between player and character. Again, my problem with these flashbacks doesn't concern their individual quality, which is pretty high if you ignore the pointless combat sections and focus on the emotional weight they carry. The problem I have with them is a structural one. The writers were keen on starting the story with the shock of Joel's death, which is a powerful opening that sets the tone for what's to come. But by doubling back so that they could have it both ways and wrap up the thread left over from the previous game, it gives a weird kind of whiplash that causes both sides to be undermined and messes with the game's immersive potential. Now you've been patient enough, so I think it's time to end your suspense and pull the pin out of that climactic confrontation with Abby. With Jesse already dead and Tommy's life under threat, Ellie surrenders her weapon, but before we get a chance to see what happens next, the writers put the pin back in the scene again and yank us out of it into another time and another place, playing as a teenage Abby. I'll return later to this flashback, but once we're on the other side of it, we find ourselves back at the start of Ellie's first day in Seattle, but this time waking up and experiencing it through Abby's eyes. If you thought Ellie's tale was just reaching its crescendo, then you'd be right. But before we can see how that plays out, the game needs to deliver on the promise made back in the prologue that there's more than one side to every story. This is the big surprise the game has been building towards, and since you almost certainly already knew it was coming, I thank you for humouring me. And once again, there's obviously a lot to be said about this perspective shift, and it gives the story an unconventional structure to say the least. The goal that the devs were aiming for here was to have you despise Abby in the first half of the game, then grow to sympathise with her in the second. They certainly accomplished the former, but after that, the entire success of the project relied on them nailing the latter. You likely have your own opinion on whether they pulled that off or not, possibly a very strongly held one, and for my part, I think the results are mixed. My first playthrough didn't see me sympathising with Abby to anywhere near the extent I think I was supposed to for the narrative to have its intended effect, but on subsequent plays once I knew the whole story, flashbacks and all, it fit together in a way that I was able to appreciate and find satisfying. In order to see why, we'll need to go through Abby's version of events, but before I do that, now that the surprise is out and both halves of the game are open for comment, I think it's time to finally start talking about combat, resources, and difficulty. Mechanically, combat is the real bread and butter of this game, and it's where all of the player's consequential decisions take place, with encounters evolving across a playthrough as new elements are added, modified, and combined to keep things fresh. Encounter arenas are big, and there are often multiple floors to keep you worrying about attacks from above or below. Terrain can range from grass to hide in, to water to dive under, and there are almost always multiple viable paths through an arena, which can lead to surprising discoveries on a second playthrough if you deliberately take a different route. Enemy types are shockingly varied for a game so focused on realism, and in arenas that feature opposing factions, it can feel incredibly rewarding to turn them against each other. As you might expect, there's also the usual slow drip of additional weapons and tools that increases the options available to you as the game proceeds, though I'll argue shortly that some very basic tools are far more overpowered and dominant than others. Some encounters are faced alone and others alongside a companion or companions, but for the most part it makes very little difference and they're more or less invisible to enemies, which I think is for the best. I didn't catch any instances of them running right through enemy sightlines, which is an improvement on the last game, though it can still be a bit annoying when they do things like push you out of the way to take the best cover for themselves. I can only recall a single moment where a companion does anything like a coordinated attack with the player, right after Dina saves Ellie in the school, but this is clearly a heavily scripted one-off. Sometimes they'll help out during stealth too, but these moments also feel scripted and it's hard to tell if this is dynamic or not. If a character helps you out with a well-placed shot in a less tightly scripted combat encounter, then it's probably by chance. I don't have a problem with this, and it means they'll never carry the game for you, but it also means that companions make basically no difference to gameplay, which you could say is a missed opportunity considering that combat is the game's most interactive and consequential feature. One thing that practically all encounters have in common, with only a minuscule handful of exceptions, is that they start with the player undetected and in stealth. This is undoubtedly a good thing, since it puts the responsibility in the player's hands to either keep it that way, carefully choose their moment to go loud, or respond in kind if the enemies spot them and start shooting. While sneaking around, you'll notice that different enemies have different sensitivities to sight and sound. You can crouch walk at full speed behind a human or infected runner, but the blind clickers and shamblers require a softer step as you close in, which raises the tension whenever they're around and means you might need to strategize which order you tackle enemies or just avoid them altogether. You have a sizable number of movement options available to you in arenas, stalking through tall grass, squeezing through tight gaps, and going prone to crawl under vehicles and other bits of scenery, all of which add a nice layer of depth to environments and can lead to some tense moments when avoiding capture. Like the previous game, this one has a button you can press to use listen mode, and just like last time, I hate this because being able to magically see through walls makes the game stupidly easy, not to mention the hammer blow it deals to immersion. I spent all of my playthroughs completely ignoring it, and the game is always playable without it. Much better without it, in fact. But I guess if you're playing without headphones, then it might be necessary to help resolve the location of sound sources. Still, I think this should be an option in an accessibility menu rather than a feature that's on by default, but since it's easy to ignore and never forced on you, I can let it go. Given how much I dislike listen mode, it might surprise you that I actually kind of appreciate the warning sound that plays when you're in danger of being spotted and gives you a chance to quickly turn back and undo your mistake. For one thing, it's way less intrusive than putting a visual marker on the screen, but it also prevents the frustration of being instantly caught by an enemy you couldn't see, and ensures that when you do exit stealth and enter combat, it's usually a tactical decision. That said, sometimes it can go a bit too far and make things too easy. When you hear that whoosh noise, you can often make it go away by just quickly lying down, though the problem here could just be that some arenas have too much grass in them. Importantly, it's possible to complete almost every encounter undetected and using only stealth if you're careful enough, which is essential because the devs can never guarantee how many resources the player is bringing into each arena. Since they could have used all their bullets and health kits in the previous one, there needs to be some way through for the player with an empty backpack, and I appreciate the consistency this brings to encounters. The exceptions here are the arenas that feature infected stalkers, which are impossible to sneak up on and seem to just magically know exactly where you are at all times while they wait for you to trigger them. These encounters feel a little bit fake to me, and I think there's no way to avoid them breaking out into combat, but I could be wrong about that. Either way, in order to make stealth a viable option, the goal in virtually every encounter is simply to get to the exit. Sometimes you need to slowly push a heavy door open to leave, which is the game's way of forcing you to either deal with nearby enemies or pick your moment very carefully. And while this becomes pretty transparent and feels contrived well before the 10th time you've seen it, it's at least very effective at preventing you from cheesing every arena. Other arenas, however, have wide open exits that you might as well sprint towards if you get spotted, and it's a bit too easy to trivialize these encounters by doing just that. You can even get away with it on the heavy doors sometimes if you're lucky, which feels a bit like cheating. The biggest problem with stealth, however, is that it's way too overpowered, although that's less true here than it was in the previous game. Sneaking up on an enemy and grabbing them for a stealth kill isn't exactly fast, but it is silent, and more importantly, it's completely free in terms of resources, which means that even if you have a full inventory, you're still heavily incentivized to do it as much as possible in the name of conserving ammo. With a bit of patience, you can remove half, and in rare cases all, of the enemies from an arena without spending a single resource, and in a game that's all about managing limited resources, you can see how this strategy is obviously the optimal one. Thankfully, as the game goes on, several factors are introduced to make this tactic less viable. The stealth-immune stalkers, the big bulky seraphites, and the shamblers, the new infected type introduced in this game, can't be stealth killed, and while you can grab dog handlers, it's not a good idea unless you want a bite in return. To help even the playing field here, the game provides you with new stealth tools, silencers and arrows, but unlike chokeholds, they actually do consume resources, and therefore involve trade-offs that prevent them from being overpowered. I can't help but feel that the stealth grab, as one of the very few actions in combat that doesn't cost you anything, could have benefited from having a similar trade-off involved. Now, if you played the game on a lower difficulty than I did, you might be wondering what the hell I'm even talking about here. Scarcity of resources, dominant tactics, strategic trade-offs, who cares about any of this stuff? Just shoot everyone in the head and shut up. Well, that's because this is the area where the experience you have with the game can vary wildly depending on which of the 6 difficulties you select at the start. I know I said this last time, but 6 difficulties? Really? Given that there's also a customizable one for the sake of accessibility, I don't see why there needed to be that many. Anyway, the 2 that I've completed full playthroughs on are hard and grounded, and while both are at the upper end of the scale, they led to very different experiences. The listen ability is disabled on grounded, but this made no difference to me, so the only distinction between the 2 was the paralyzing and all-encompassing lack of resources on the highest difficulty. While the player technically has all the same tools and options available to them, the punishing scarcity of ammo and materials on grounded mode means that you can't actually use any of them, and that leaves you with only the very tedious strategies that exploit overpowered stealth mechanics and use as few resources as possible. Perhaps needless to say, the game is a lot more enjoyable on lower difficulties where you're actually allowed to use your weapons. It might have been more bearable if enemies played by the same rules as you and didn't have infinite ammo, but I guess that could have been exploitable in its own way too. I'll admit that sometimes it feels pretty good when you finally make it through a tough area with minimal expenditure, but when it follows dozens of unsuccessful attempts, it comes as more of a relief than a triumph. Most of my grounded playthrough didn't look like that. Most of my grounded playthrough looked like this, constantly pushing and testing at the limits of what I was allowed to get away with, opening the menu to smash that restart button again and again and again when I got caught, because I knew that there were simply too many enemies for me to deal with in open combat. This doesn't make the game harder in a way that's interesting, it makes it harder in a way that's tedious and honestly kind of dull, and this is alongside the obvious damage it does to immersion. There's a fine balance that needs to be struck between making the player feel like their actions have consequences, that is, by having effects on their limited resources, and giving them the leeway to have enough options available to them to deal with encounters in clever ways. By limiting resources so much that you're restricted to the most tedious playstyle imaginable, Grounded mode fails to strike this balance, and for that reason I can't recommend it to anyone but the most dedicated masochists. Instead of arbitrarily removing most of the resources from the world, I think one way to make this mode work could have been to lower the cap on how much ammo and materials the player can carry, which would have allowed them to make use of the weapons and tools in the game while still treating them as more precious than on other difficulties. Unfortunately, I'm not done moaning about resources yet, because regardless of the difficulty you're playing on, there's really only one way to get more of them. It's true that enemies will sometimes drop ammo or materials when killed, but this is far from reliable and happens way less frequently than in the previous game. The only sequence where it happens consistently is Ellie's flashback to the standoff in the hotel, and the contrivance this brings to the scene is one of my many motives for disliking it. But anyway, the main reason why enemies elsewhere in the game don't need to drop resources is because there are usually more than enough for the player to find sitting around in the environment. Which means that when you're in between encounters, you'll be spending a lot of time running around looking for them, and it doesn't take long for this to start getting tiresome. An attempt was made to spice this up with the safes and locked room puzzles I mentioned earlier, but there are only so many of them, and the majority of pickups are found in cupboards, drawers, side rooms, on shelves, under counters, in an endless parade of grabbing without ever being asked to actually think about what you're doing. Despite the cluttered environments that you navigate in this game, only a very small fraction of objects are interactable or collectible, and while it's probably a small mercy that not every bathroom cupboard and kitchen drawer can be yanked open, maybe you can see how there's something quite arbitrary and artificial about dragging the camera around every room and mindlessly pressing Y whenever the game tells you to. When the explorable locations start getting much bigger, this gets even worse, and you might still be scouting around for items long after the characters have run out of dialogue to fill the silence. Sometimes you can spend so long scavenging that your companions will start barking at you to follow them to the exit, like they think you're lost, but of course this is almost never the case, it's just that you haven't finished checking every surface yet for something you're allowed to pick up. My point here is not that every object in the world should be interactable. My point is that the interactions that are there should be meaningful and involve a bit more input from the player than just running around and exhausting all the icons in a room before moving on. The main problem I see with the current implementation is that there's no cost or decision making involved in gathering resources during downtime, which means there's no reason not to waste your time searching every desk and every corner to make sure you didn't miss anything. As a counterpoint to this, there are often items to grab while inside encounters as well, but because there's an element of risk involved in going out of your way to get them, there's an argument to be made for leaving them behind, and therefore a genuine decision to be made about whether to try and pick them up or prioritize getting to the exit. On Ellie's second day, you pass by a cafe on the way to the hospital that's clearly full of infected, but the only way inside is to break a window and alert them to your presence, which means you actually have a choice to make about whether you think spending resources to kill them will be worth whatever you might find inside. On my grounded playthrough, I passed by without disturbing them because I figured it probably wouldn't be worth it, and that was a choice I made for myself. I think the game could have benefited from a few more optional arenas like this, or maybe even from putting infected clearly visible inside certain locked rooms, so that the player could choose whether they still wanted to find a way inside or not. Following that principle of asking the player to decide for themselves the relative value of different resources, I have to wonder if some kind of inventory management system might have given the player a bit more input in collecting them, though I'm aware that this could get tedious if done carelessly, so I can see why the devs wanted to avoid it. Still, if Resident Evil 4 can make it work, I'm sure Naughty Dog could find a way if they really wanted to. If you could choose whether to carry more explosives at the expense of sharp objects, or more bullets at the expense of health kits, or some other similar choices like that, there could have been a bit more depth here. In the game's defense, there are trade-offs to make about how to spend resources after you've collected them, but if you play carefully and conservatively, these trade-offs disappear, and it's quite possible to have a full stack of both health kits and Molotovs, despite them requiring the same resources to craft. Again, to make crafting decisions more consequential, a global inventory limit, rather than an independent limit for each item, could have made this more interesting to engage with. When you find yourself flush with resources like this on difficulties other than Grounded, because this never happens on Grounded, there are a couple of effects that follow. On the one hand, I think the relatively low limit on how much you can carry of each ammo type, material, and crafted item is a good thing, because when you know you're close to full, it means that you have less reason to be stingy and might as well play through firefights rather than restarting to stay in stealth. But what it also means is that when you're in between encounters and looking around for things to press Y on, it's even more of a waste of time than usual because half of them will be greyed out and there's nothing you can do with them. Figuring out the way into a locked room and then not being able to collect most of the things inside makes for an unrewarding diversion, as I'm sure you can imagine. So maybe now you're thinking, okay great, if your inventory is full then you don't need to worry about scavenging and can speed up your playthrough by skipping it. Well, no, you can't, because there are two resources, scrap and medicine, that are essential for upgrading weapons and abilities, and they have no limit on how much you can carry, so they're always important to pick up and always worth checking every corner for. Again, some kind of inventory management to enforce stricter limits here could have livened this up and introduced some choices for the player to make. Now, we got here through a pretty roundabout way, but the final area of gameplay I need to cover before getting back to the story is what combat looks like when stealth fails you and you enter an open firefight, and this can vary depending on the type of encounter. When fighting infected, they will almost exclusively just run towards you in a straight line, which means that your best bet is to pick them off as they come to you, and the only real choice you need to make is deciding which type of ammo you want to expend on them. Don't get me wrong though, that is a consequential decision, so even if they can be samey, these encounters are not as boring as I might be making them sound, and the triumph you feel when you line things up just right to get a 2-for-1 with a single shotgun blast cannot be overstated. Sometimes you'll encounter a scene where you need to stand your ground as they stream in from multiple entry points, and in those cases you need to maintain a bit more spatial awareness since they'll be running at you in a straight line from more than one direction. As if to really prove the point here, the closest thing the game has to a boss fight, the Rat King in the hospital basement, involves it, or I suppose them, rushing towards you in a straight line. Despite being very mechanically simple, this fight is another part of the game that's easily carried by the sheer spectacle of it, and the presentation of both the build-up and the fight itself make it an unforgettable sequence. The Stalker breaking off halfway through is a disgusting surprise that adds another layer of terror as you continue to sprint away from his big brother, now paranoid that every corner could conceal a lurking monster. When it comes to human enemies, they're a lot smarter than infected about approaching you from different angles, and this can lead to some genuinely panicked moments as they close in on multiple flanks. While they can usually be taken down with a single headshot, it's not always easy to nail this under pressure, and if they know your position then one of them might be pointing a gun at it, just waiting for you to stick your head out, in which case it's better to stay down and move away even if you think you have a clear shot. Most encounters feature a mixture of enemies armed with guns and melee weapons, so a distant one with a rifle might cover his friend as he tries to get in close with a lead pipe to give you the Joel treatment. Sometimes they'll hurl an explosive or sick their hound on you, and you'll need to take cover and or send it to doggy heaven, but there's nothing mind-blowing here. Usually in fights against humans, it's not their behaviour, but the terrain that makes the encounter memorable. Overgrown car parks, seraphic farmlands, flooded shopping centres, the variety here is pretty amazing, and all of these arenas present unique possibilities for using the environment against your enemy, from an emphasis on verticality, to a field of crops to disappear into, to a whole new way of navigating around unseen. So moving on to the player's options in combat, there's a good number of weapons that feel distinct enough from each other to fill different roles in your arsenal. A handgun, a more powerful handgun, a shotgun, a rifle, a silent bow, throwables for hitting multiple enemies. There's a diversity of use cases that makes them all feel useful. What you may have noticed from the footage here, however, is that the options available to you as both Ellie and Abby are very close to being interchangeable, and I think Naughty Dog missed a major trick here in not making Abby's gameplay feel as different as possible. The most notable difference between them is that Ellie is able to perform stealth kills on clickers for free, while Abby has to spend resources on a shiv to do so, which, funnily enough, is something she has in common with Joel from the first game. I don't know if this similarity was intended or not, but in any case I think a mechanic that was unique to her, and maybe gave us some insight into her character, would have fit the bill a little better. To be fair, there is the unlockable momentum ability that lets you chain together melee kills, but it's optional, missable, and only usable in specific circumstances, so in my multiple playthroughs I never got much mileage out of it. You might assume that Abby would be a bit handier with melee weapons than Ellie is, but in actual fact melee attacks are equally overpowered as both protagonists. Abby because of her brute strength, and Ellie because she's the only character in the universe sensible enough to carry a knife. For both characters, it's easy to take down almost any lone enemy by using the identical and repetitive strategy of dodge and punish, and I assume this is a feature left over from the game's focus on melee combat early in its design. In fact, since doing this gets you the kill for free without using resources, there's a clear incentive to exploit it and make use of melee as much as possible, especially against infected who are going to be running straight into close quarters either way. Or at least, this is the case until you pick up a more powerful melee weapon that does more damage but has limited durability, which will take over your attack button until it breaks. While I appreciate that the extra damage of these weapons makes melee viable in more situations than just a one-on-one, and that reinforcing and repairing them gives you another thing to spend materials on, I still find it quite annoying because it forces you to use up resources on something that you would ordinarily get for free, if only your default attack hadn't been taken away from you. For instance, attacks on a stunned enemy are always an instant kill, whether you have a strong weapon equipped or not, but in the former case it uses up durability, and in the latter case it's free. To be honest, this is a minor gripe, but as an inconsistency of control, it still irritates me and feels quite arbitrary. As for the guns you have access to, they all function pretty much exactly how you would expect, so it's not worth going into detail, but there is an outlier here that's deserving of comment. If you shoot an enemy anywhere but the head with a small gun, they'll stagger for a second but soon go back to normal like nothing happened, even if a bullet just went through their knee. This is how practically every shooter in existence works, so I'm not singling out The Last of Us here, and I suppose it's necessary in order to make the risk-reward of going for headshots balance out. It does feel a little bit cheap that the heavy Seraphites can take multiple shots to the dome before going down, but again, for the sake of balance and preserving their intimidation factor, I think it's easy to let go. Now, just by the way, it's sort of funny that the Seraphites are the only group capable of producing big brutes like this. What the hell are they feeding them on that island? The real thing that's worthy of mention here, however, and the entire reason I'm bringing this up, is that when it comes to bigger weapons, and the shotgun in particular, it's obvious that getting hit by a blast with that wouldn't result in you losing health points, it would result in you losing body mass. And well, that is exactly what happens. Heads will pop like balloons, limbs will go flying, insides will be torn to shreds, and enemies will wail in horrific agony as the blood gushes out of them to pool ingloriously on the floor. The first time you clock this, it can be quite a revelation. In most games, when an enemy is taken down, you can instantly forget about them and move on, but here, their sickening cries may just haunt you into the next room. As always, this gets points for realism and contributes greatly to the game's incredible presentation, but I don't think this is spectacle just for the sake of it. Shooting people in the head to instantly kill them is a concept that's been gamified well beyond the point of parody by now.
Headshot.
But I don't think it takes much imagination to step back from the fantasy for a second and realise just what a horrifying and life-changing thing it would be to see that happen in front of you for real. The Last of Us is a rare experience that doesn't sanitize the horror of what human beings are capable of doing to each other's bodies, and in fact, that's kind of the whole point. It doesn't want to glorify the violence, it wants you to experience firsthand exactly how disgusting and traumatic it is. In keeping with the game's wider theme that every side in a conflict has its own perspective on events, the enemy's sympathetic responses to being maimed are there to remind you, or attempt to remind you, that these aren't just random NPCs who are only there to soak up your ammo supply, they're characters in their own unseen story. They have relationships of their own with other people, and they don't want to die senselessly bleeding out on a dilapidated rooftop. To reinforce this, enemies will call out to their friends and their dogs by name, and lament their death if they come across a corpse, at least as much as a single line of NPC dialogue can be expected to do so.
Austin!
In order for the hyperviolence inflicted on enemies to mean anything though, it's essential that it comes as a choice in the player's hands, as something the player does to them, not something the game's script does to them, which is another reason why it's important that so many encounters can be resolved by avoiding enemies instead of turning their heads into wallpaper paste. Additionally, since the spectacle of the brutality loses its effectiveness over time, the fact that the player has alternative options available to them helps to stop them getting too desensitized to it all. Even so, in scripted set pieces that don't involve any player choice, the devs make sure the violence retains its impact by dialing it up even higher than usual, with uniquely grisly scenarios that wouldn't be possible during ordinary gameplay. I can't help thinking of the team of artists at Naughty Dog who must spend all day looking at reference pictures of severe bodily trauma, and I'm curious what their thoughts are on the subject, and also whether that's what they expected to be doing when they went into a career in 3D design.
Jesus. What the fuck, people?
Just as a very quick aside while I'm here, this is hardly a hot take, but I think it's pretty absurd that I can show you this hyper-real violence without any fear of censorship, while a scene of two characters loving each other puts me on very shaky ground and might even be reason enough for a video's removal. I'm allowed to show you human bodies being blown into chunks of dog food as long as those chunks stay clothed at all times. I could go on here, but this script is getting long enough already, and in any case it's a comment aimed more at platform censorship than at the game, which to its very respectable credit isn't shy about displaying the human form. The very last observation I want to make before returning to the story concerns a feature that's actually new to this remake version of the game and is accessible from the main menu. Back when the first game was originally released back in 2013, it came with a multiplayer mode, which is something that boardrooms and market forces obliged every game at the time to do. For this remade sequel, they've dropped the multiplayer shtick, but instead included a roguelike mode called No Return. Oh, how the times have changed. I promise I won't dwell on this for more than a minute, but I do think it's worth bringing to attention just how much the existence of this mode contradicts a lot of the themes present in the main game. No Return features the same ultra-violence, but it's ripped out of any sort of narrative context and turned into a meaningless exhibition of gore that can be repeated as many times as the player likes. In No Return, when you sever an enemy's leg and watch them roll around in the dirt, you're not doing it as part of a broader parable about the sickness of seeking revenge, you're doing it because you think it's fun. In a game that's literally all about the tragedy and senselessness of humanity's perpetual conflict, there must have been someone on the dev team who noticed the irony of giving the player a mode where they could senselessly slaughter to their heart's content, and I can only assume that they were told to be quiet. If you like this mode, then great. I'm not trying to take it off you, and I have nothing against you playing and enjoying it, but I think it's obvious why I find its inclusion confusing from an artistic standpoint. As before, there's more I could say here, but it really is time to move on now. So, let's return to the start of our first day playing as Abby. And just as a reminder to give you an idea of what's going through the player's head right now, this is coming right after 10 hours or so of playing as Ellie, looking for Abby so that she can kill her. Our introduction to Abby's life in Seattle is much the same as Ellie's back in Jackson, which I'm sure is intentional. This is one of many parallels we'll be seeing between both characters, just to make absolutely sure we don't miss that they're not so different after all. We meet Abby's friend and roommate Manny and the heavily pregnant Mel, both of whom were present at Joel's death back in the prologue, and get a walking talking tour of the former sports stadium that the wolves call home. It's a fascinating bit of world building, and it does a good job of immediately establishing that the wolves are a group as human as any other, just trying to survive and make their lives comfortable. There are some really thoughtful touches here. Food being moved around and prepared, people washing clothes or taking a break to sit and read, livestock grazing on the field, and I especially like the part where Manny does this. But perhaps these wolves are all too human, because already we can see an ugly side to them in the gleeful delight that Manny apparently takes in slaying Seraphites. Fast forwarding through her first extended gameplay sequence, when Abby and co make it to the forward base to meet Isaac, commander of the wolves, we're likewise treated to an uncomfortable vision of what they do with Seraphite prisoners. This one recoiling in terror as the player approaches them is a particularly sickening touch, and with every character so far being completely unfazed by the conflict, I guess we can take it for granted that they're all on board with the rivalry being justified. Abby, as Isaac's top Scar killer, has clearly drunk this Kool-Aid too, and is just as casual about dehumanizing them as everybody else. The gist of this meeting with Isaac is that he wants to launch a raid on the Seraphites' island home in a couple of days' time to exterminate them entirely. But as always, this high-level plot stuff isn't especially important, and it takes a back seat to the protagonist's character-driven motivations. Abby finds out from Nora and Isaac that Owen has gone missing after killing one of his fellow wolves for unknown reasons, so she defies Isaac's orders to go and find him. Along the way, she's captured by Seraphites and due to have her guts pulled out, but her intestinal yanking is interrupted by the arrival of a couple of defiant Seraphites, Yara and Lev, who are apparently slated for a torturous execution as well, and they form an unlikely alliance to escape. There's an extended bit of melee-only combat here before Abby gets her gear back, which works fine as part of this set piece, but by the time it's over, there's no escaping the fact that melee is a very shallow part of the game, with dodging and punishing being the answer to pretty much every single enemy. Also worth noting here is the contrast between the genuine pitch-black darkness of this forest escape and the ambient night light that's present in every other evening scene. I don't mind this ambient lighting, even if it is unrealistic, and in fact, I didn't even think about it until the more lifelike darkness of the forest scene called attention to it. But I think the incongruity serves as more evidence that Immersion is all about consistency, not realism. Anyway, after setting Yara's broken arm and leaving the two seditious Seraphites to their own devices, Abby heads on alone to look for Owen. Now, unfortunately, because Abby's half of the game is just as riddled with flashbacks as Ellie's, I have to pause here and jump back to provide some context. Believe it or not, before the end of Abby's first day, there have already been no less than 3 flashbacks, or 4 if you count the repeated showing of Joel's death from her perspective. The first one, which is how Abby's half of the game begins, is a quick introduction, and then a quick goodbye, to her father, the Firefly doctor who was due to perform Ellie's lethal surgery, and apparently the only person capable of making a cure for the cordyceps infection. There's really only so much the game can do to endear us to Abby's father in just a couple of minutes of walking and talking, and naturally there's no way he can be established as a character of anywhere near the complexity of most of the others. He's pretty much just the best dad ever for about 5 minutes of screen time, and there's not much deeper insight to be gained by paying attention to their dialogue or reading between the lines, which makes this whole scene a bit of an outlier for the series. Of course, Abby's reaction to his death at Joel's hand is very understandable, and it's obvious how it would be character forming, but after knowing him for 5 minutes, the player has no hope of going on that journey with her, and more or less has to fill in the empathetic blanks for themselves. The comparable scene on Ellie's side of the game, Joel's death, is clearly going to have a stronger effect on the player than the death of a random NPC they already killed without thinking twice at the end of the previous game. So even with Abby's tragic backstory in mind, she's not likely to be on equal footing to Ellie in the player's consideration. Abby's second flashback finds her and Owen exploring the aquarium in Seattle together for the first time. And the upshot in terms of character exposition is that Abby's single-minded obsession with getting revenge against Joel is destructive to all of her relationships, and especially to her romance with Owen. The end of this sequence, where she turns down the chance to stay the night with him in an underwater dome so that she can go back to base and keep training, has a quiet tragedy to it, and Owen's resigned acceptance that he will never be able to get through to Abby is as plain to read on his face as the pity in his voice.
You go ahead.
Just as in Ellie's flashbacks, the quality of the writing and performances in the dramatic scenes isn't up for debate as far as I'm concerned, but I have a similar issue with their structure and the interruptions they deal to the present day narrative. The purpose of Abby's flashbacks is essentially to just dump a bunch of context and exposition on you, and I can't help feeling that there could have been a better way to achieve the same without breaking continuity.
I told you already. Don't be sorry.
For instance, while breaking into the aquarium in that second flashback, Abby has an offhand line about how much weight she's been able to lift thanks to her obsessive training. Obviously, this serves as an explanation for her muscular physique in the present, but any attentive player will already be capable of putting two and two together without the need of this throwaway dialogue. 1, she has an all-consuming desire for vengeance, and 2, she has easy access to gym equipment. It's not hard to picture her spending day after day taking out her futile frustrations on a set of dumbbells at the expense of all of her relationships with others, and I appreciate the fact that her character design tells us quite a lot about her. If the context about her and Owen's relationship, which is really the only important thing in these flashbacks, had been presented in a similarly naturalistic way, I think the game's structure could have flowed a bit better. In the third and final flashback, Abby returns to the aquarium a year later, sometime after Owen has given up on her and started a relationship with Mel instead. There's still a certain chemistry between them, but he seems to have let her go as a lost cause. This is where Abby reveals that she's found a lead on Joel's whereabouts, which brings the flashbacks full circle to the prologue and wraps them up.
It's a lead. I gotta see it through.
And that brings us back to the present day, where Abby finds Owen hiding in his boat at the aquarium, just where she knew he would be. To be fair to the writers, all of the context we've been given about their relationship via flashback is necessary to make this scene work. I just wish they'd found another way to deliver it. Looking at this scene as an exchange between two characters with a complex history, which is exactly what it is, I think there's a lot to enjoy and appreciate about it. Firstly, it's revealed that Owen has come to recognize the senselessness of the cycle of violence between Seattle's two factions, which makes him the first character to become aware of the game's overarching theme. The rest of the story is just everyone else either catching up to him or dying for the sake of nothing. His plan now is to leave it all behind and sail down to Santa Barbara in California, where a rumored Firefly reunion is supposed to be taking place. When Abby chides him for this, he deploys the classic couples arguing trick of using her own words against her.
It's a lead. I gotta see it through.
And since he's been drinking, he's not shy about making it known how disgusted he is by her prioritizing vengeful murder over their relationship. They fight, they kiss, they make up, you know the rest. Plenty has been said about the seconds that follow, and yes, it is quite a surprise on a first playthrough, but clearly that's intentional, and I think it's tasteful enough. And look, if you're willing to let the game shock you by doing this to its characters, then you need to be willing to let the game shock you by doing this, or you're just not being fair. This game is for adults. Think about it like an adult. The morning after, Abby dreams of Yara and Lev strung up and with their guts hanging out, and with a pang of responsibility for their circumstances, goes back to check on them. With Yara's arm in dire condition, Abby teleports them back to the aquarium with a continuity demolishing hand wave that the player is politely asked to ignore. Mel, who is also suddenly there now, needs clean medical supplies from the hospital in order to safely perform an amputation, and with this MacGuffin provided, Abby sets off with Lev to go and retrieve some. So begins what I think is supposed to serve as Abby's redemption arc, as through Lev she comes to appreciate the other side's perspective and breaks through the programming she's received from Isaac and the wolves. You see this change gradually as she moves from calling them scars to Seraphites. The Seraphites are clearly still an insane cult, but that's hardly the fault of the individual members who live tightly controlled lives and know of no alternative. As in real-life cults, there must be some manipulative leader or group of leaders pulling the strings, but we never see them in-game. It's also implied in incidental dialogue here that Abby feels guilty over all the deaths she's caused, including Joel's, or that's how I read it anyway.
Needed to lighten the load a bit.
This second day is actually remarkably light on cutscenes, and since the whole point is to attempt to show a bond developing between Abby and Lev, I think it's for the best that the player remains in control for as much of that as possible. Abby's fear of heights, which has been alluded to throughout her story, gets its payoff here in a textbook example of Chekhov's acrophobia, as the shortcut Lev drags her along to reach the hospital involves scaling along fallen cranes suspended between the rooftops of skyscrapers. It's a little bit contrived, but at least it makes for a memorable set piece, and this gag got a genuine laugh out of me.
What's going on between you and your friend Owen?
Oh my god, Lev, now?
It seemed really awkward.
Just go!
It's not only a well-timed joke about Lev's lack of socialization, but also seems to me like Naughty Dog taking a light-hearted jab at themselves and the way that their games usually deliver dialogue while making the player do something mindless. This crane sequence is also, quite fittingly, an excellent example of the difficult balancing act that is maintaining a player's immersion, because following the principle that the player should be sympathizing with their character at all times, the intention here is for you to feel the same terror that Abby does. Any player tempted to stick around and admire the view is reminded of that by the vertigo effect that occurs when you look down. If you perfectly walk the narrow pathway that the developers intend, both literally and metaphorically, you can make it through this scene with your immersion intact and possibly an elevated heart rate. If you don't, and you notice that certain segments are impossible to fail, or that in the segments when you can fail, it doesn't really matter anyway, then your immersion and your sympathetic connection to Abby will take a 40-story leap and turn into jam on the pavement. It's a nice touch that you can look up and see the cranes in certain of the chapters though. When they finish getting to the bottom of this building the slow way, Abby leaves Lev behind to enter the hospital alone and gets immediately handcuffed for defying Isaac's orders. Nora stays loyal and frees her at considerable risk to herself, but even so, Abby lies to her face about why she's looking for medical supplies, which I suppose makes this the turning point where she's really chosen a side and can't go back. One basement boss fight later, and Abby and Lev are in a motorboat on their way back to the aquarium, where Yara's arm successfully comes off and Abby smiles in the satisfaction of saving a life for a change. If this is supposed to be Abby's redemption, then it looks like the books have been balanced, doesn't it? She took a life for the sake of revenge, now she's saved a life to break a cycle of revenge. That may be the case on paper, and I don't really have a logical argument against it. But the thing is, the player holding the controller is not a dispassionate robot doing ethical accounting on an abacus. The player had a personal attachment to Joel that Yara has no chance of matching or making up for. Even 2 days into playing as Abby, and even acknowledging the game's theme of vengeance bringing nothing but misery upon everyone involved, there's absolutely no guarantee that the player doesn't still share Ellie's wish of seeing her dead. While that wasn't the case for me, I did still spend my first playthrough of Abby's chapters expecting and waiting for her story to intersect with Ellie's, as the game had already shown me it eventually would, and every plot point that passed by where that didn't happen felt like an irrelevant annoyance. Who the hell are these people? What does this have to do with Ellie? You could point the finger at me for not being receptive enough to what the game wanted me to experience, but after the game just spent 12 hours putting me into Ellie's head, can you really blame me? The immersive connection between player and character that's ordinarily the strength of the medium might just be working against the game in this case, but that's a thought to return to at the end. Now that I've had a while to fully digest the story after multiple playthroughs, I feel more positively about it as a whole, but the simple fact remains that it's not possible to maintain a sympathetic connection with both protagonists at once when their goals are in conflict, and that reality will come crashing into the picture on Abby's third day and then some. After another restless night, Abby wakes up and walks right into a dressing down from Mel, whose hatred of her is understandable given the tension over the question of Owen's affection, but still hard to care about because it all happened before the events of the game. In fact, a few minutes later when Mel isn't looking, Owen gives it one more try with Abby in the hopes that she's finally healed enough to be capable of a human relationship. In case you can't tell, I find Owen to be one of the more tragic and sympathetic characters in the story, though like everyone else he has his flaws, and getting Mel pregnant was kind of a dick move considering he would still leap at the chance to be with Abby instead. But still, his relationship with Abby is the only one in her half of the game that really feels like it changes or develops over time, which gives them a far more believable connection than Abby has with anyone else. Owen is almost as much of a victim of Abby's father's murder as she is, but unlike her, he never wanted revenge. All he wanted to do, though Abby wouldn't let him, was move on from it and enjoy the lives they're lucky enough to have. We're allowed to be happy, as he puts it. Abby gets no opportunity to reply before being whisked away by the plot. Yet another tragic mischance in their relationship, and also, as it happens, the last chance. They'll never speak to each other in private again. Ironically, it's Owen's act of mercy towards Ellie and Jackson that ends up getting him killed later. Perhaps one of the biggest misfires in the game's attempts to garner sympathy for Abby's side of the story comes in this segment where you're forced, yes forced, to throw a toy for this dog that we know Ellie will be killing in a few hours. It's a pointless waste of time, and it feels inauthentic and cheap to be made to sit through this slow, plodding bonding scene after the fact when we already know that the pooch is going to be mincemeat soon enough. It's as if the devs weren't sure that turning Ellie's targets into sympathetic characters was going to work, so they tried throwing some dogs into the mix as well, just to be on the safe side. I so desperately wanted to skip this on later playthroughs, but I wasn't allowed. The excuse the devs came up with for a third day of combat encounters as Abby is that Lev steals the motorboat to return to the Seraphite Island and convince his and Yara's mother to leave with them, a prospect Yara informs us is impossible given their mother's strictly conservative adherence to the cult's rules. The reason Yara and Lev are on the run from the Seraphites, incidentally, is that Lev defied tradition and an elder's expectations by shaving his head and refusing to live as a concubine. Lev is 13, by the way. Like Abby's weightlifting, this is another part of the character's histories where it's not difficult to put two and two together for yourself, especially when Seraphites in combat call out to Lev by his old name. I don't think it was necessary for Yara to explicitly lay it all out for the player here, especially given that Lev never seems to think it's worth hashing out like this, but I guess it's fine. In order to chase after Lev, Abby and Yara need to go and fetch another boat from the marina. Sound familiar? And when Abby gets there, it's the point where her story finally starts crossing over with Ellie's. This sequence where you inch forward through cover while Tommy takes pot shots at you is pretty enjoyable and quite unique from a gameplay standpoint, but nevertheless an awful dread began to squirm inside me as I remembered what all this was leading towards. There's a smart twist here. Back in one of Ellie's flashbacks, Tommy teaches her to snipe at the environment to make noise and attract infected to the source, and in any other game, this would be a tutorial setup to prepare the player to do it themselves later. In this game, that old trope is wonderfully turned on its head when the trick gets used against the player later instead. Very clever. Seeing Tommy, a character almost exclusively viewed from up close in cutscenes at the distance usually reserved for disposable NPCs, is also a nice touch and a valiant attempt at keeping the player in Abby's shoes here. But when she says, "I can't wait to get my hands on this guy," the disconnect between her and the player is no longer possible to ignore, since the overwhelming likelihood is that the player does not want to hurt Tommy. Being forced to follow the script and push forward regardless of your own wishes produces a discomforting feeling that I presume is intentional, and will be repeated 1,000 times more strongly at the end of the day. In this case, however, the tension collapses if you think about it for more than a second and remember that Tommy has to show up later in Ellie's story, so he can't die here. Not only is there a gulf between Abby and the player's desires, there's also a gap in knowledge that makes it even harder to maintain a sympathetic connection with her, making the deflating tension in this scene another casualty of the game's schizophrenic structure. Manny makes his final appearance here too, but as a character with no real influence on the plot and no meaningful relationship with anyone else, his presence in the game doesn't do a good job of living up to the story's premise of making the player empathize with both sides of a conflict. He appears in this scene for one reason and one reason only, so that he can be killed off to tie up the loose end, and this is transparent enough that I think most players will see through it and write him off as a disposable character, which he is. When Tommy ends up being pushed into the water, you can see the "oh shit" of recognition in Abby's face, but that thought and the dissonance of this sequence are shelved for a while as she and Yara head for the Seraphite Island, and it just so happens that they're doing so on the same day that Isaac is leading the wolves there for a direct assault. Looking around the cult settlements you pass through on your way across the island offers a very small window into what the lives of the people there might be like, but with the game so close to the end now, I think it was the right call to keep this to a minimum and preserve some forward momentum. We catch up to Lev, but his mother is already dead, killed by mistake in self-defense after she attacked him. Apparently she hit the table, but what table? I don't think Lev is lying here. I think the scene was just rushed and was really a thin excuse to get Abby onto the island. Lev seems to get over it pretty quickly either way. Not long after, Isaac emerges from the trees in another final appearance that, like Manny's, feels as though it happens just so he can die, and despite being mentioned constantly, he doesn't have much of a presence in the game. This exchange does give Abby a chance to prove to herself and to the player that she really has passed the point of no return in where her loyalties lie, but I think that's been made clear enough by now, so the real purpose of this scene is to wrap up more loose ends. When all is said and done, Isaac is probably the closest thing this story has to a villain, though if we buy into the main theme, then it's possible that there's a lot of information we just don't have about what led him to this point. It's implied that he's responsible for the current conflict between the two factions by making a martyr out of their prophet, but I think we can reasonably assume that there's also some council of elders among the Seraphites who are profiting from and playing their own part in perpetuating the rivalry. Either way, having led the wolves to the point of invading their island and killing the Seraphites in their homes, there's no possible way Isaac can cede ground to Abby here and admit that they might be equally as deserving of a happy life as his own group is. For his stubbornness, he receives a shot in the back from a near-death Yara, and she dies too. Now on the run from both wolves and Seraphites, Abby and Lev only have each other to rely on, but even so, when Abby says, "You're my people," after knowing Lev for exactly 2 days, it rings a bit hollow and doesn't feel deserved. The trajectory of their relationship is, I think, an intentional retread of Joel and Ellie's in the first game, but since their bonding plays out in fast forward, it just doesn't hit with the same resonance as the slow burn that worked so well last time. They seem to get along just fine right from the beginning, and there's never any sort of personal conflict between them that needs to be progressed through and resolved. Perhaps this is why their relationship just doesn't benefit from the same well-earned charisma that Joel and Ellie's did, and if the devs are deliberately inviting the comparison, then it's not a favourable one. Following this, there are just a handful more encounters, featuring both wolves and Seraphites fighting each other, which makes for a nice twist and a fitting extension of all the gameplay mechanics that have been explored so far. The real crown jewel of this chapter, however, and of the whole Wolf-Seraphite conflict as a whole, is the frantic horseback ride through the burning Seraphite capital, which is pretty much the perfect capstone to the game's theme of senseless conflict. There's so much going on as you gallop through that it's impossible to process it all, just getting enough time to identify sketches of the terror both sides are inflicting on each other, which really convincingly sells the chaos of this moment and the absolute breakdown in humanity that's taking place. The fact that this all happens while the player is still in control makes this into a jaw-dropping spectacle that hits like a truck every time I play through this game. Like Abby and Lev, your only desire here will be to put as much distance as possible between yourself and the depraved brutality unfolding in front of you. My only criticism of this sequence is that it pulls that good old trick of magically giving you infinite ammo for the duration, which I'm not sure was strictly necessary, but I can forgive it this time. The phenomenal pacing of this borderline on-rails horror show makes for a stark counterpoint to some of the more open areas that you can spend way too long slowly combing through, and while I'm sure a well-balanced game needs a healthy mix of both, I do think The Last of Us leans a bit too far in one direction. The power of forward momentum is more evident in this scene than anywhere else, and I think it's something worth remembering. After a suitably gory final melee encounter, Abby and Lev grab a boat and return to the aquarium to find the corpses of Owen and Mel waiting next to a map left behind by Ellie. Cut to the theatre, and 10 hours after we left it, we're finally getting back to the scene we left Ellie on, this time from Abby's perspective. Which makes this a great moment to pause one last time and consider how well the game has achieved its goal of producing sympathy in the player for Abby. It's clear that great effort was put into making her a believable character, and the devs certainly did a better job with her than in 99.9% of characters from across all of gaming. In addition to what her physique tells us about her, there are other details to notice for those paying attention. She collects unique coins as a way to remember her father, and she's also fond of classic literature.
Hey, you done with Monte Cristo yet?
Her fear of heights is a humanizing force that makes her a little more down to earth, and lets us know early on that there's more to her than first impressions might suggest.
I'm not as fearless as you think.
She also has a remarkable amount in common with Ellie, which can't have appeared in the script by chance. They're both in love triangles with another woman who's pregnant. They both had a father figure taken from them by brutal murder. They've both forged unlikely close relationships after going through traumatic experiences. They've both lied to their companions. Ellie because she doesn't want them to know how obsessed with revenge she is, and Abby because she doesn't want them to know that she's no longer interested in perpetuating a cycle of revenge. I'm sure it was a deliberate choice to keep Abby's story separated from Ellie's for the majority of our time playing as her, to give us a chance to see her as a protagonist on her own terms, with independent relationships and troubles that have nothing to do with Ellie, but I think the success of that choice is mixed. While Ellie's story is a very simple one that's immediately and entirely all about revenge, Abby's story is kind of all over the place, and you never know what justification the writers will be coming up with next to give us something to chase around Seattle for. Thanks to this, you probably noticed that I was able to poke a lot more holes in Abby's half of the plot than in Ellie's, which doesn't do it any favours and leaves it with a number of scenes that feel like filler, to be glossed over once they've done their job of moving the characters from A to B. I guess you could say the overall theme of Abby's story is redemption, but it takes a while to get there, and it's starting from scratch in a way that puts it at a distinct disadvantage coming after Ellie's, who the player is practically guaranteed to relate to more strongly. And since we know for a fact that their stories are going to be crossing paths eventually, I think it's understandable that some players might simply spend all of their time playing as Abby, looking forward to that cliffhanger being resolved, without caring much about what she gets up to in her spare time. I find myself wondering if this whole two-sided story concept could have worked better with the order reversed. First get us to sympathise with Abby, then put her into conflict with Ellie and let the player feel anxious about how it's all going to end. It might have messed with the punchiness of the prologue if Joel's death had to wait until the player had built up a connection with Abby, but I think it could have served the central concept better. With the game's current structure, even though we spend half of it playing as Abby, it never really feels like the story is about her, and it's hard to see her and her crew as anything more than a foil for Ellie, because that is exactly what they are. We play through Ellie killing all of these people who are nothing more to her or to the player than targets of retribution to be eliminated one by one, and only then do we go back and see them fleshed out a bit more from Abby's perspective. But when we already know that these characters are fated to die by Ellie's vengeful hand, it gives their dramatic scenes together a sort of drawn-out fatality. We know something they don't, which creates a barrier that no amount of humanizing can break through. As far as the player is concerned, these characters only ever existed for Ellie to kill them off, and in fact, from the player's perspective, she already has. This leads to a similar issue to the one I had with Ellie's flashbacks continually resurrecting Joel. Rewinding time to show us how these characters actually had complex lives and relationships of their own is great and all, but it's a little late for that now, isn't it? Even if we put all that aside and imagine that the devs did the best possible job of making Abby's crew sympathetic, the very fact that she's in opposition to Ellie will be enough to prevent some players from liking her. It may not be the response the devs were hoping for, but it's an understandably human one, and I wouldn't necessarily blame players for continuing to feel that way on a first playthrough. In a way, it's a testament to the powerful bond players have with Ellie that so many were reluctant to see things from a rival perspective. Asking the player to sympathise with, and literally put themselves in the shoes of the major parties on both sides of a conflict, is a fascinating idea that willfully flies in the face of conventional wisdom about what a sequel should be, and I love it in concept. But the devs may have shot themselves in the foot by making one side of that conflict a character who players have a whole other game's worth of sentimental attachment to. When it came to trying to make Abby as likeable as Ellie, the devs were starting on the back foot, to put it mildly. This is one of those things you can argue was the point, and that it makes the subversion of expectations even stronger. It certainly leaves a lot of room for polite and rational debate, that's for sure. But if it prevents the main theme of the game from landing, as it did for some very vocal players, then you've got to wonder if it was the right call. All of this is to say that the player will be heading into the final confrontation as Abby with a complicated cocktail of feelings inside them, and presumably no idea how it's going to end. When I was going into this sequence for the first time, I had an uneasy, apprehensive feeling that I find difficult to put into words. It was clear that nothing but suffering lay ahead, and yet still there was no way to stop it from happening, like helplessly watching a car crash in slow motion. And maybe it's that absolute helplessness that's the key ingredient to making this scene so uncomfortable. The player has willingly dived into countless violent confrontations by this point, and now they're faced with one they don't want to engage in, but they have to go through with it because it's what the characters want. I didn't want to kill Ellie, obviously, but I didn't think Abby deserved to die either. And besides, decades of inbuilt gaming instincts meant that I tried my best to not see my avatar get killed. Basically, it was an unstoppable force, immovable object situation, and it unsettled and disturbed me, maybe to an extent that no other game has. For this scene alone, The Last of Us Part 2 is one of the most unique games I've ever experienced, and whatever you think about it as a whole, you can't say it doesn't take risks and go to bold new places. I've seen this climactic part receive criticism for the dissonance it imparts to the player, and I hate to be that guy, but this time I think that dissonance really is the point. I've spent most of this video advocating for the connection between player and avatar to be kept as strong as possible, and I still believe that should be followed as a general rule in game design. But the rules of design are there to create a set of standards and expectations, so that when you break one of those rules deliberately, it can have the biggest effect possible. This sequence purposefully breaks that so-called rule, and breaks it hard, so as to leave you in no doubt that it was intentional. As both protagonists seek vengeance on the other, we feel alienated from both of them and are powerless to prevent the senseless tragedy unfolding. In games, a medium well known for delivering power fantasies to their audience, making the player feel so completely helpless despite still being in control of their character and advancing as intended is a fascinating achievement and a wonderfully uncomfortable thing to experience. While the earlier section against Tommy spares the player from having to deliberately act against him, no such mercy is shown here, and you have to attack Ellie to proceed. Unfortunately, the gameplay side of this scene is kind of shit, and getting insta-killed by Ellie multiple times as you try to figure out what the fuck the game actually wants from you here robs the sequence of its forward momentum, on top of the constant interruptions to immersion that allow plenty of time for that feeling of anxiety to simmer down into frustration instead. Deliberately breaking the consistency of character is one thing, but this scene also shatters consistency of control by suddenly switching up the rules on you on how combat works, since Ellie will dodge attacks from the front in a way that no other enemy ever does. I get that the devs wanted this confrontation to be more unique and suspenseful than most, but I'm not sure they went about it in the right way. Once you manage to get the better of Ellie 3 times, the game goes full cutscene mode before Dina comes to her aid and Lev intervenes, first to save Abby and then to remind her that she's supposed to be above retributive violence at this point in her character arc. Apparently, Abby really is big enough to let it go, perhaps because Lev is all she has left now that all of her friends are dead. Whatever her reasoning, she leaves with a warning for Ellie to stay away for good. And then there's an epilogue. At least 9 months later, Ellie and Dina are living in something like domestic bliss on a farm outside Jackson, a dream they talked about fulfilling way back on their first day in Seattle. And they're also taking care of the baby JJ, whose name could be an homage to Joel or Jesse or both. I know it's a little late in the day to be looking for plot holes, but it seems to me that it's unnecessarily dangerous for them to be living alone like this. In the post-apocalypse, safety in numbers isn't just a platitude, it's a commandment for survival, and they're vulnerable to raiders or attackers, not to mention the hordes of infected that apparently roam through the countryside in seasonal migration patterns. Regardless of the risk, Dina seems happy enough with the arrangement, and Ellie is doing an admirable job of going through the motions, but she's haunted by post-traumatic episodes that keep her frozen in time and unable to move forward with her life. When Tommy shows up one day with new evidence of Abby's whereabouts, he's only too willing to guilt-trip Ellie into following up on it, since his body is too broken to do it himself. Dina chases him out, but Ellie can't let it go and hardly needed the encouragement anyway, so it's not long before she tries to make a stealthy exit in the night to abandon her family and go after Abby instead. Dina catches her and forces Ellie to make that choice to her face instead of disappearing behind her back, which she does seemingly without regret, and her rejection of Dina here is an echo of Abby's earlier rejection of Owen. This is where an obsession with the past gets you, and the people in your life can only wait for you for so long before they give up and leave you behind. There's a fake out as the game cuts to Abby and Lev breaking into a house in Santa Barbara and locating a Firefly base beneath it, where they achieve Owen's dream of making contact with the scattered remnants of the group, albeit over radio. On their way out, they're captured by the Rattlers, a local group of slavers, and we cut back to Ellie for the final stretch of uninterrupted gameplay in The Last of Us Part 2. If you'll allow me to indulge in one last dig at the game's plot holes, the ease with which characters seem able to travel around the continent stretches disbelief just a little bit, especially considering that the entire narrative of the first game hinged around how difficult and dangerous traversal is in this new and broken world. Throwing in the occasional journal entry in Ellie's diary isn't really enough to paper over this inconsistency, and it's something you basically have to just ignore if you want the story to stay intact. And speaking of the story staying intact, it's awfully convenient that there always seems to be some traveller passing through and bringing just the bit of news that a character was waiting for. This happens twice, once to tip off Abby about Tommy and Joel's location, and then again to reveal to Ellie where Abby is, which pushes the number of coincidences in the story well past acceptable levels. This one in the epilogue is particularly hard to swallow coming so close to the end, and Ellie teleports to California like she's using fast travel, but at least the sunburn on her arms is a nice visual touch. This final segment as Ellie features a few separate encounters and is more or less a victory lap of all the game's mechanics. A bit of traversal, a couple of run-ins with infected, a new firearm to get to grips with, and some expository lore to discover about the Rattlers before going up against them in the toughest combat encounters in the game. These guys are merciless slave drivers, and the point is hammered home multiple times that death is preferable to living under their yoke, so the player can slaughter them without guilt, which is handy because there are a lot of enemies in these encounters, and in the final one I'm pretty sure more of them spawn in to make stealth impossible. Some of them have helmets to make the usual dominance of headshots less viable, but to even the odds there's a new option available to the player here as well, in the form of releasing chained up infected to take advantage of the chaos they cause. Well, it's not really a new mechanic, because there are plenty of spots in Seattle where you can do exactly that by throwing a brick, but the difference in presentation makes it feel new. Yet more evidence, if you needed it, that presentation is one of this game's greatest strengths, and can make up for shortfalls in other areas when done convincingly enough. When you're finally through the hordes, Ellie frees the Rattler's slaves and learns that Abby has been tied up on the beach to die of exposure after attempting an escape. As Ellie stumbles down to the shoreline, the former slaves arm themselves and guarantee their freedom permanently, perhaps the only completely justified act of violence in the story. And at last, after coming so far and losing so much, after abandoning her family and loved ones and travelling halfway across the continent, Ellie has Abby right in front of her, the object of all her rage and hatred within her reach, missing her braid, emaciated by hunger and burned red by the California heat. But once she's been cut down, Abby has no interest in Ellie at all. Her sole concern here is in grabbing Lev and getting both of them to safety, and she completely ignores Ellie until pushed to do otherwise. Clearly, Abby is well past caring about petty revenge, and actually has something meaningful to live for now, both in protecting Lev and in honouring Owen's memory by reaching the Fireflies. In case you missed that Ellie's refusal to move on from her fantasies of vengeance has turned her into the villain, she threatens Lev's life to force Abby into fighting her, and the final cinematic confrontation begins. In terms of gameplay, it's a little repetitive, and it only asks you to do the usual dodge, dodge, punish that you've spent the whole game doing, but as so often before, it's carried by the presentation, the savagery, and the tension over not knowing how it's going to end. Despite losing a couple of fingers, Ellie gets the upper hand and has Abby drowning to death under the water. But then, after coming all this way and giving up everything to reach this moment, she changes her mind at the very last second and lets it go, begging Abby to get away and take Lev with her. Now, there's plenty of space to overanalyze and discuss Ellie's thought process here, and as the story's last dramatic climax, it invites comparison to the previous game's ending as well. Back then, we were thrown into a scenario where saving a girl's life, a trope so often used in fiction as a lazy shorthand for heroism, was recontextualized as a selfish and cowardly act. It was such a brilliant subversion that it came to define the first game's story, and that kind of foundation-shattering, infinitely debatable, impossible to resolve moral quandary isn't present in the sequel in quite the same way. There's no ethical problem to chew on and take with you, because clearly choosing forgiveness and coexistence makes for the more optimistic and good ending, however many mistakes it takes for our flawed heroines to get there. What this conclusion does leave you questioning is what the point of all the struggle and bloodshed was. Undeniably, in the end, it was all for nothing. And maybe that lack of point is the point, in which case I can't really fault it for that, but I can say that it doesn't have quite the impact of Part 1's ending. On my first playthrough, I was disappointed to see Ellie pull away at the last minute like this. Not so much because I wanted Abby dead, but because I wanted it for Ellie after everything she'd been through to get it. Such is the power of the sympathetic connection players have built up with her after 2 games. Earlier drafts of the story saw her going through with it and getting her revenge, but on reflection, I think it was the right call for the narrative to have it end on a more encouraging note. If Ellie had chosen to kill Abby, what would she have done with Lev? Left him there to die? Killed him in cold blood just for being close to Abby? I don't think anyone, neither the writers nor the players, want to believe that Ellie is quite that far gone. If we look at her actions leading up to the fight with Abby, I think we can learn a bit about what motivates her final choice. She could have stabbed her in the back at any point here, or for that matter when she was tied to a post, but I don't think that's what she really wants. In her last 2 encounters with Abby, she survived both times only because of an act of mercy by somebody else. In order for her to catch up to the theme of the story and let go of that desire for vengeance, she needs it to happen on her terms. She needs to be the one to choose mercy, not have it cast upon her in pity. This is why, with a flash of memory of the last moment she spent with Joel, she's only capable of letting it go at the exact instant that her revenge is finally assured. But she's known the whole time that it will never make her happy either way. With her decision made and her humanity intact, Ellie teleports back to the farmhouse for one last scene, a couple of fingers lighter and with an immense weight lifted from her shoulders. Just as promised, Dina hasn't waited around, and she's coming back to an empty home. When she picks up her guitar and tries one more time to play the first song she learned from Joel, which she's repeatedly done throughout her story, she's now unable to do so, and at long last she can move on and stop reliving the same moments in her head over and over again. But even here, in the closing minutes of the game, we're not safe from being thrown into a flashback, and Ellie recalls, perhaps for the first time with fondness instead of guilt, the final interaction she had with Joel the night before his death. While still resentful of him for lying to her and taking away her chance to make a meaningful sacrifice, now that the truth is on the table, it's possible for Ellie to actually process how she feels about it. There are countless justifications Joel could attempt to give for his actions here, but as a heavy silence hangs in the air between them, it's clear that they all speak for themselves. The fact that Ellie is able to live and draw and learn to play guitar and have a first kiss with Dina and have this conversation with Joel right now is justification enough, so all he needs to say is that he would do it all over again.
I would do it all over again.
It seems that Ellie can empathise after all, because she vows to try to forgive him. Joel replies with his typical talent for understatement, and that's it. We're really done this time. At the risk of belabouring the point, I don't love the fact that we're learning about this important memory only after seeing it influence Ellie's fateful decision to release Abby, but I think I've made it clear by now how I feel about flashbacks and their effect on continuity. And also, because I can't help picking flaws even in things I enjoy, it has to be said that although half the game belongs to Abby, this finale can leave the player in no doubt that the story was really about Ellie and Joel all along, which does feel like it grinds a little bit against the broader theme of everyone being the protagonist in their own tale. Still, I can let that go because I like seeing Ellie get an optimistic ending, and the promise of absolution makes for a nice beat to wrap everything up on, however much flashback time travel contrivance is necessary to get it. If the player is left with anything to mull over as they head into the credits, it's this. You can't do anything about other people's actions, and sometimes you can't even understand them. But what you can do is open yourself to seeing things from another perspective. What you can do is try.
I like that.
However you feel about it, The Last of Us Part 2 is going to be remembered, admired, and argued about for many years to come. You may have noticed that this video is pretty long, and the reason for that is that there's so much to say, so much to read into every character's movements and facial expressions and delivery of dialogue that you can discuss this game for hours before even mentioning the gameplay. As in its predecessor, the plot is pretty simple. It's the characters that are complex, which offers limitless room for interpretation of their motivations and makes watching cutscenes into a rewarding part of the game. Let me say that again. Watching cutscenes is a rewarding part of the game. That's how good they are. When I say the characters are complex, I suppose what I mean is that they feel lifelike. With Dina, for instance, it's not that we know tons of exposition about her backstory or where she's coming from, it's that her actions within the story are consistent and believable enough that we can easily get a good understanding of what's important to her and how enamored she is with Ellie. Rarely do we learn what characters are feeling through explicit dialogue. Instead, we have to read between the lines and observe their behavior over time, which we can do because a monumental effort was put into making these characters feel more true to life than practically anything you'll find in other games. I hesitate to make a comparison to cinema because I feel like it cheapens the dev's achievements somehow, but I'll just say that this game will engage the same empathetic circuits in your brain that a great acting performance does in film. That laser focus on believability extends to environments as well, and the overgrown, flooded, and dilapidated ruins of Seattle are a phenomenal backdrop to the human drama playing out within. Scrambling across that environment in predetermined set pieces is enjoyable despite being mechanically shallow because of the spectacle and credibility of the presentation. Remember, there isn't a speck of white paint anywhere to be seen in this game to lead you around important ledges, and with that artificiality removed, you're free to get immersed and think about your surroundings as a real place. When that illusion has taken hold of you, you won't care that all you're doing is holding forward and jumping, at least not on a first playthrough. Once you're in a combat scenario, you can use that same immersive environment against your foes, skulking through the grass that's reclaimed the city's roadways and disappearing into the water that's inundated the former shrines to human consumption. There's certainly more going on mechanically inside these combat arenas than outside, and the variety of scenarios the game puts you through is nothing short of incredible. But the main way it pulls you in and gets you invested in encounters is by ensuring that your actions have real consequences and cost you something, and I really cannot overstate how key this is. It's perhaps the major benefit of having a linear structure over the open world one that's so common today, and it's why those games feel like such a hollow waste of time once you've spent a few hours in them and noticed that your actions have zero consequences. When resources are strictly limited in a finite world, you directly feel for yourself how precious they are, and you personally feel the pain of every missed shot or wasted health kit, which means that your choices in combat are genuinely meaningful and have a lasting impact. Unfortunately, since stealth and melee are options that don't cost you anything, intentionally or otherwise, you're nudged towards exploiting them. This was true on all of my playthroughs, but was far more pronounced on the highest difficulty, and honestly, I wouldn't even recommend bothering with it. For the best experience with this game, just pick hard mode, put on some good headphones, turn off the listenability, and play through your mistakes when you get caught. Another area where the gameplay could do with some tightening up is in the gathering of resources, which can take up a surprising percentage of the runtime considering how boring it is, how arbitrary it is, and how little input it asks from the player. All you need to do is run around every room pressing Y whenever the game tells you to, and checking every surface becomes especially tedious when those rooms are very big. Just a touch of inventory management could have gone a long way towards presenting the player with some actual consequential decisions to make in these moments. The safes and locked room puzzles are a great step towards making resource gathering less boring, but they're just a little bit too easy, and in pretty much every case you're looking for a window to break, a piece of scenery to throw a rope over, or both. Making ropes a global item you can use anywhere, rather than a context-sensitive one that gives away the puzzle whenever it's present, could have made this more interesting, as well as putting enemies in side areas to give the player a choice to make about whether it's worth looking inside or not. As it is now, it costs you nothing to break into every room and exhaustively search them for resources, so there's no reason not to do it, tedious though it is. Finally, on gameplay, I'm all for the inclusion of exciting and unique set pieces, but when the usual rules of the game have to be broken to make them work, it feels false and it harms immersion more than it improves it. The infinite ammo bandana that your character equips whenever you're riding a vehicle is the most obvious example of this break in consistency, but one appears in the climactic fight against Ellie in the theatre as well, as she behaves unlike any other enemy in the game. I get that an encounter so vital to the story should feel unique, but I think that should be achieved by adding new rules on top of existing ones, not by overwriting the old ones and forcing players to relearn how the game works. If it feels like I'm being overly critical of the game here, then that's only because it sets such an astoundingly high standard for itself that even the smallest inconsistencies of control, context, and character stand out as glaring flaws. Seriously, in what other game would it be worth pointing out the incongruity of incidental dialogue like this? The only reason this feels inconsistent is because of how strong and effortless the connection between player and character ordinarily feels. Perhaps it slips up occasionally, but I think the consistency of immersion in this game is about as good as can possibly be expected of a team of 1,000 people working with the technology currently available to them. And that brings us back around to the goals the devs had with this game, because when the seed of a project is the desire to tell a certain story, every other element can be judged by how well it serves that central pillar. And you could even say that the gameplay itself is just part of the presentation of that story. So when we zoom in on that central pillar and examine the story, there are two questions we need to ask. Firstly, how good is it? And secondly, how well is the story told through the interactive medium that the devs used to present it? It's not really possible to separate the story from its presentation and view it in isolation, but for what it's worth, I think the story is pretty good now that I've been through it multiple times. And once you know all of it and replay the game knowing the full context for every scene, you'll realise how much you missed the first time round, though that's not necessarily a good thing for that first playthrough. Still, as a sequel, it advances the arc of Ellie's life in a way that's surprising and yet still feels true to the young girl we met in the first game. Killing off her mentor and protector now that she has nothing more to learn from him makes perfect sense narratively and also makes for a perfectly shocking way to bring her into conflict with Abby. The big surprise that the second half of the game will see you building up some sympathy with Abby as you see her perspective for yourself is a brilliant twist, and if some players showed resistance to doing so, then it only proves just how good the game is at putting you in Ellie's shoes. Sadly, while Ellie's chapters are purely about her descent into a revenge-obsessed madness, Abby's narrative is a lot less focused, and maybe it bites off a little more than it can feasibly chew in the 10 hours afforded to it. It has to set up her own feelings about revenge, her relationship with Owen, the conflict between the wolves and the Seraphites, the bond that grows between her and Lev, not to mention her relationship with her father, who in the final assessment only gets a few minutes of screen time. Abby starts at an obvious disadvantage to Ellie, who had a whole other game's worth of context for us to learn about her character, so they'll never really be on equal footing. But even so, I think the story does an admirable job of making Abby sympathetic and complex, mostly through her relationship with Owen. The first half of the game gives you the revenge fantasy you wanted, and then the second half rips it away from you to show you how empty and self-destructive that impulse really is. By the time the two protagonists reach their final confrontation, it should be clear that Abby doesn't really deserve to die, and it feels right that Ellie has grown enough to break free of the grip that vengeance held on her, as the player hopefully has too. So that's the story, but how about the way it's told through the interactive medium? This is a strictly linear game, and the band of interactivity in which the player is allowed to make consequential decisions is exclusively confined to the combat encounters. Outside of that contained sphere of combat and resources, you're just along for the narrative ride. I don't have a problem with this, and the encounters do their job well of pulling you into the characters' heads in the immediate moment, both in Ellie's merciless quest for revenge and in Abby's slow abandonment of her tribe as she comes to realise what's actually important. Part of the reason I went out of my way to reveal things in order and preserve some sense of playing this game for the first time, however, is because that first playthrough is very different to all subsequent ones. With a story that jumps around as much as this one, the order the devs choose to present scenes to the player is crucial in forming their first impression, and experiencing the game a second time when you already know the story is very different. The frequent flashbacks the game subjects you to in order to provide necessary context for events in the present feel like an intrusive way to give exposition, and I don't think it plays to the strengths of the medium by regularly interrupting continuity. While the scene of Joel confessing the truth to Ellie is a brilliant dramatic story beat, when you think about it, it's sort of just inserted at an arbitrary spot into the actual story, and I think this shows the clashing priorities that the devs had over where they wanted to go with the narrative. They kill Joel, they bring him back. They kill Owen and Mel, they bring them back. Having it both ways just doesn't seem quite right to me, and it's too little too late to humanise the bickering pair after the player has already killed them. Again, I can't help wondering if the devs didn't get this all backwards, and if it would have been better to stay with Abby for the first half before switching back to Ellie, but I guess we'll never know. And yet, though I can poke holes in the game's presentation and quibble about whether it was achieved in the optimal way, if I've learned anything from playing it, it's that sometimes you just need to let things go and be thankful for what you have. The forest I should take care not to miss for the trees is that the devs even attempted to tell such a unique story in the first place. The gameplay may have a stunning amount of variety, and there may be an impressive visual spectacle to pick up the slack when you're doing something mechanically simple, but the real innovation Naughty Dog is bringing to the table, and what you really came for, is the narrative context they provide for that gameplay. And oh baby do they deliver on that promise with ambition. By leading development with the character-focused narrative placed above all else, both parts of The Last of Us have become unrivaled endeavours at storytelling through the medium of games. But while the first game was made to be as accessible to as wide an audience as possible, this sequel seems to have been designed specifically to be challenging. Not in terms of gameplay, which is still easy to understand, but in how it asks the player to open themselves to the question of whether their actions and the actions of their favourite characters are just, which almost every other game takes for granted and will never ever ask you to consider. There are several spots in the narrative where this can lead to a feeling of profound discomfort, and this game wants you to sit in that feeling and ask yourself what it means. The point of this story isn't just that revenge equals bad. It's one thing to say that, a whole other thing to show it, and a completely different ballpark to have the player experience for themselves the way that both sides in a conflict can feel that they're in the right, and how they can be completely blinded from seeing the other side as legitimate, or even as human at all. This is precisely the arc that Abby goes through in her half of the game, and it's surely what the player is intended to grow to realise as well. If that doesn't land for you because you came into the experience with your mind firmly set that Abby deserves punishment and refuse to accept any evidence to the contrary, then that doesn't make you a bad person, but you've allowed yourself to miss out on one of the most uniquely fascinating experiences the interactive medium is likely to offer for quite some time. For all of its many flaws in execution, The Last of Us Part 2 is a magnificent achievement that once again raises the bar and puts other AAA efforts to shame. The highs and lows of emotion that it put me through are unforgettable, and the story that it tells is timeless. There is no good, there is no evil. There are just messy, tragic, damaged human beings struggling to live together in a frightening world. They hurt each other, they help each other. They kill each other, they love each other. Can you really blame them?